Vernon Pike didn't knock. He pushed open the door of the Red Hollow Courier with both hands like he owned the building, because he did, though nobody in town had figured that out yet. He dropped a folded paper on the editor's desk without sitting down, without greeting the man, without anything resembling courtesy. "Run it Friday," he said, "front page. Big as you can make it." The editor unfolded the paper and read it twice. His face went the color of old ash. "Vernon, there's nothing here that proves." "I didn't ask what it proves." Vernon picked up a glass paperweight from the desk, turned it over once in his hand, set it back down. "I asked you to run it. The editor ran it. And Bramwell Thorne lost everything but the land they hadn't yet figured out how to take from him. If this story already has you feeling something, if your chest tightened just now at the sight of a man destroying another man's name with one folded piece of paper, then you are exactly who this story was made for. Subscribe the channel right now so you never miss what comes next. Every week we bring you stories about people who were counted out, lied about, and underestimated, and what happened when they finally stopped accepting what others decided for them. Hit that like button, leave us a comment with the city and country where you're watching from tonight. We genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This one takes its time, and it earns every minute. The advertisement in the Helena Weekly Gazette was 8 lines long. Bramwell Thorne had written it himself, which explained why it read less like an invitation and more like a list of facts presented without apology. Rancher, 31 years. Mountain property outside Red Hollow, Montana. Seeking a wife of practical disposition, no romantics. Honest woman preferred. Children welcome if they exist. Travel and board provided. Reply to Box 14. Elowen Hart read it 3 times at the kitchen table of her family's homestead, and the 3rd time she read it, she was already doing arithmetic in her head that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. The Hart homestead sat on 40 acres of cracked earth outside a small town called Delwood, 2 days east of Helena. 2 years of drought had turned what had once been decent farmland into something that looked like it had already given up. Her father, Gerald Hart, was a good man in the way that some good men are good kind to his children, fair with his neighbors, completely outmatched by practical misfortune. He had borrowed against the property twice. He was about to lose it. Elowen was 19 years old. She had 2 younger brothers, 11 and 8. She had a mother who had worked herself to a permanent stoop and a cough that showed up every winter and stayed longer each time. She had $12 in a tin box under her mattress, a talent for keeping household accounts, and no patience left for waiting to see what happened next. She wrote back to Box 14 that same evening. Her letter was also a list of facts, 19 years. No children. Experience with livestock, crop management, and household accounts. No romantics. Elowen Hart, Delwood. The reply took 11 days. It contained a train ticket to Helena, a connecting coach arrangement to Red Hollow, and 4 sentences. Travel arranged for the 14th if agreeable. I will meet you at the Red Hollow stage office. The journey to the ranch takes 2 days by wagon. Bring what matters to you. B. Thorne. Her mother cried when Elowen showed her the ticket. Her father went very quiet and stared at the kitchen wall for a long time before he said anything. "You don't have to do this," he said finally. "I know that," Elowen said, which wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough. She recognized him immediately, which surprised her because she hadn't expected him to look the way he looked. She'd spent 11 days constructing a version of Bramwell Thorne in her imagination, a hard-featured man, probably heavyset, someone who'd grown accustomed to silence because nobody had ever wanted to listen to him. The kind of man who bought a wife because he couldn't find one any other way. The man standing at the stage office in Red Hollow was lean and dark-haired with weathered hands and an expression that wasn't unfriendly so much as deliberately careful, like someone who had learned to measure the cost of every word before spending it. He was watching for her before the coach fully stopped, and when he spotted her climbing down, he moved toward her without hesitation. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Thorne," she said. They stood there for a moment, 2 practical people conducting an honest assessment of what they'd agreed to, and then Bramwell picked up her larger bag without asking and carried it to the wagon. That was the whole of their introduction. Red Hollow itself took about 3 minutes to pass through, and as they did, Elowen noticed the way the town behaved around Bramwell Thorne. It wasn't overt. Nobody threw anything or shouted. It was quieter than that, and worse. People looked at him, the way you look at something you've already decided about, a glance and then away, A deliberate turning of the back, a sudden interest in a storefront window. Two women on the boardwalk watched the wagon pass and leaned together and said something behind their hands. Bramwell kept his eyes on the road. Elowen filed it away. "People here don't seem to think much of you," she said, when they were clear of town. A pause. "No," he agreed. "They don't. Is that going to be explained to me at some point? Or are we leaving it as is?" He glanced at her sideways, just once, quickly, like he was recalculating something. "At some point," he said. She decided to accept that for now. The first day of travel was mostly silence, but it was a different kind of silence than she'd braced for. He wasn't ignoring her. He was paying attention to everything at once. The road, the horses, the weather moving in from the west, her. When the temperature dropped in the late afternoon, he said, without looking at her, "There's a coat behind the seat. You should put it on." It was his coat. It was too big for her by a significant margin and smelled like wood smoke and pine resin. She put it on. When they stopped for the night at a traveler's shelter he clearly knew well, had probably used dozens of times, he built a fire, prepared a meal from supplies he'd packed with specific care, bread that wasn't stale, dried venison, dried apples, coffee. He gave her the better of the two bedrolls without comment. "You didn't have to do all that," she said, watching him eat. "I know," he said. And then, after a moment, "You're going to be living somewhere unfamiliar. Starting rough doesn't help either of us." It was the longest sentence he'd produced since the stage office, and she turned it over in her mind for a while before she said, "That's a practical observation." "I try," he said, with something in his voice she couldn't quite classify. Not quite humor, but something adjacent to it. She didn't sleep badly, which also surprised her. The second day, something shifted. Not dramatically. He wasn't suddenly a different man. But there were small things. He pointed out a hawk riding a thermal to the east, with the casual ease of someone who spends enough time outside to notice such things and value them. He stopped at midday and checked the horse's feet without being prompted, explaining briefly, without condescension, that the left rear shoe on the roan was wearing unevenly and would need attention before the week was out. When she asked questions direct, specific questions about the ranch, the land, the water situation, he answered them directly. Not everything, but what he answered honestly. By late afternoon, she had a clearer picture of what she was going to. The ranch was isolated, genuinely isolated, a 2-day ride from the nearest town of any size. He ran cattle and horses, more horses than cattle. The land included 3 natural springs, which in this part of Montana was not nothing, was in fact a significant fact about why this land was worth something. There were neighboring homesteads, not many, but a few. He had no household help. "What happened to your last wife?" she asked. The question came out more bluntly than she'd intended, but she'd decided in the first hour of the first day that blunt was going to be necessary with this man. A long silence. "She died," he said, "and my daughter." "How long ago?" 4 years, I'm sorry, Elowen said. He nodded once and looked at the road. She waited, but nothing else came, and she didn't push it further. Not yet. The ranch was not what she'd expected either. She'd been prepared for neglect. A man living alone for 4 years in an isolated location. She'd expected a certain degree of entropy. What she found instead was a property that had been maintained with a kind of grim, methodical determination. The fences were in order. The barn was clean. The horses, there were 7 of them in the main corral, were clearly well kept, their coats smooth, their conditions good. The house itself was plain, nothing decorative about it, but clean and structurally solid and better built than anything she'd grown up in. He showed her through it with the manner of someone conducting a practical tour. Here is the kitchen. Here is the larder. Here is what we have in the way of supplies. He showed her the water situation, how the spring fed into the holding tank, how the tank was managed through the dry months. Then he showed her to the bedroom. It was a real bedroom, larger than she'd expected. A proper bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a real mirror above it. A window that looked out toward the eastern slope, where the aspens were beginning to turn gold at their edges. On the pillow was a small carved wooden horse, no bigger than her hand. The workmanship was careful. Simeon had spent real time on it. "That can be moved if you'd rather," he started. "No," she said before she'd finished thinking about why. "No, it can be fine there." She picked it up, turned it over. Carved into the underside of the base, small but deliberate, L. T. "Who is LT?" she asked. Something crossed his face quick and then gone. "It was my daughter's," he said. "Lucy." He said it quietly, and then he said, "The other room is where I'll be sleeping." If you need anything in the night, knock once. He walked out and pulled the door closed behind him, and that was the end of what should have been a wedding night. Elowen sat on the edge of the bed for a while, holding the little carved horse, looking at nothing in particular. She was not a woman given to crying. She'd done her crying earlier in her life, when she was younger and believed that it changed anything. It hadn't, so she'd largely stopped. But something cracked open in her that evening that she didn't entirely have language for. Sitting in a stranger's house in the mountains, with a carved toy in her hands, and the sound of the man, who was now her husband, moving quietly through the next room, getting ready to sleep alone on her wedding night, not because she'd asked him to, not because there'd been any negotiation, but because he'd simply decided that was the right thing to do. She cried, not long, not dramatically. She sat there in the near dark and cried, which she would have been embarrassed to admit to almost anyone. And then she put the wooden horse back on the pillow beside her and lay down in her clothes and stared at the ceiling. She was still awake when the night sound settled. The horses moving in the corral, something in the trees, the distant sound of wind coming down off the higher elevations. She thought about the two initials, LT. She thought about his face when he said the name, Lucy. She thought about the way Red Hollow had looked at him as they passed through. Something had happened in this valley before she arrived. Something with weight to it. Something that had bent the shape of this man's life and then been frozen in place, held in amber by a town's collective memory. She was going to need to understand what it was. Morning came with cold light through the eastern window and the smell of coffee already made. He was at the stove when she came through, had been up before her, which she should have expected. He handed her a mug without ceremony. I'll need to check the east fence line this morning, he said. You're welcome to come or to stay. I'll come, she said. All right. She drank her coffee standing by the window, looking out at the land she was now part of, whether she'd fully reckoned with it yet or not. The mountains to the northwest were already lit at their tops, the lower slopes still in shadow. Before we go out, she said, I want to ask you something. He waited. The wooden horse, she said, and the two markers under the cottonwood tree. I saw them when we came in yesterday. One of them said Maribel. The other was too small for me to read. Something went very still in him. Lucy, he said. Your daughter, yes. She was 6 years old, he said. After a pause, they both died in the winter of '83. Fever and cold together. By the time I understood how bad it was, the passes were already closed. I went for help anyway. On foot, in a blizzard. It took me 2 days to reach anyone, and by the time I got back with a doctor, they were gone. He said this in the same even, careful voice, used for everything. And that was somehow the hardest part to hear. That he'd carried 4 years of that, in a voice that didn't shift pitch. Elowen looked at her coffee mug. And Red Hollow blamed you, she said. They decided I'd waited too long to go for help, he said. That I should have read the weather sooner. Left earlier. Had you? A pause honest, not defensive. I've thought about that question every day for 4 years, he said. I don't know. I think I went as soon as I understood the danger. I can't be certain. But the town is certain, she said. The town was certain by the following spring, he said. Once it was in the newspaper, it became settled fact. Elowen looked up at him. What newspaper? The Red Hollow Courier, he said. There was a piece about the deaths. It described. It said there had been negligence. No name cited. But there was only one person who could have been blamed. And you never challenged it? He picked up his own mug. I buried my wife and my daughter, he said. I came back to this ranch. I wasn't thinking about newspapers. Elowen stood there for a moment, turning that over. All right, she said. Let's go look at your fence line. The east fence ran along the lower edge of a broad meadow that ended at a tree line of pine and fir. The grass was still green in the protected hollow, watered by one of the springs that came out of the hillside above. She watched him work. He moved along the fence with an economy she associated with people who'd done physical labor so long it had become unconscious, checking posts, testing wire, replacing a broken section with the replacement materials he'd loaded into the wagon before they left. She worked beside him. She wasn't a woman who stood and watched while someone else worked if her hands were available. He noticed this without commenting on it, simply handed her the wire stretcher when he needed a second person and showed her how to hold the tension without instruction or patience testing. They worked in mostly comfortable silence. Then a rider appeared at the edge of the property. He came from the south, along the road that ran down from the higher range, and he rode with the unhurried confidence of someone who was used to arriving wherever he chose, without much concern for whether he was expected. He was well dressed for this part of Montana, a good coat, good boots, a horse that cost more than most of the homesteads within 20 miles of here. He reined up at the fence and smiled at them both. "Bramwell," he said, as though they were old friends rather than whatever they were. "Been a while." Bramwell had gone very still, not alarmed exactly. But the ease that had been in his body all morning was gone, replaced by something attentive and careful. "Vernon," he said. The man's eyes moved to Elowen with unguarded assessment. "And who's this?" my wife, Bramwell said. "Elowen." Vernon Pike, because she understood, from the way Bramwell said his name, that he was someone she needed to know, immediately extended his hand toward her, over the fence, with the smile of a man who had learned that smiling opened most doors before he had to consider whether to force them. "Vernon Pike," he said. "I do business throughout the territory. Livestock mostly, but a small, expansive gesture. Land when the opportunity presents itself." Elowen shook his hand once, briefly. "Elowen Thorne," she said, using the name deliberately. Something shifted, almost imperceptibly, in Vernon's expression. "Thorne," he repeated. "Congratulations, then. Didn't know Bramwell had that in him. Is there something you wanted?" Bramwell said. "I was in the area," Vernon said pleasantly. "Thought I'd stop by. See how things are going up here." His eyes moved across the meadow, the spring line, the fence they were repairing. Something calculated moved behind the pleasant expression. "Beautiful property, Bramwell. I've always thought so. You know my offer stands." "It stands where it always has," Bramwell said. "Which is nowhere I'm interested in." Vernon smiled. It didn't reach his eyes, and she suspected it never did. "Well," he said, "that could change. Circumstances change. You know where to find me." He turned his horse without hurrying and rode back the way he'd come. Elowen waited until he was out of earshot. "How long has he been after this property?" she asked. "Since before Maribel and Lucy died," Bramwell said. He was still watching the empty road. "And after they died? Did he make the same offer?" Bramwell looked at her. "He came to the funeral," he said, "with an offer, which I declined." Elowen turned back to the fence and picked up the wire stretcher. Her hands, she realized, were very steady. She found the letters 3 days later. She'd been going through the barn with the systematic attention she'd been giving to every part of the property, understanding what existed before she decided what needed to change, and behind a loose board in the tack room, inside an oilskin pouch that had kept out moisture for years, she found a bundle of letters. They were from people she didn't know, neighbors, a business contact in Helena, a man who signed himself simply Doc R. The letters covered about 6 years. They described a man who lent tools without being asked and didn't require them returned on a schedule, who sent beef when a neighboring family's winter provisions ran short, who was the first person anyone called when a horse was in trouble, who showed up without comment when there was work to be done. The last letter in the bundle was from Doc R., and it was dated 2 weeks before the winter that took Maribel and Lucy. It mentioned that Bramwell had ridden 12 miles in early snowfall to bring the doctor to a homesteader's child with a fever. The child had survived. She put the letters back carefully and retied the bundle, and sat for a moment in the tack room, looking at the oilskin pouch. Then she found the newspaper clipping. It was tucked in separately, not with the letters. It was from the Red Hollow Courier, dated March 1884. The headline read, "Winter Tragedy in Thorne Valley, Negligence Suspected in Deaths of Woman and Child." The piece was unsigned. It described a rancher, not named directly, but the location and circumstances were unmistakable, who had waited beyond reason before seeking help for his ailing family, a decision the paper characterized as callous disregard for the lives of those dependent upon his care. She read it twice. Then she folded along its original creases and put it in her apron pocket and walked back to the house. That evening, she asked him directly, "Did you know Vernon Pike has financial interests in the Red Hollow Courier?" Bramwell looked up from the harness he was mending. "I suspected it," he said. "I couldn't prove it." "How long have you suspected it?" "Since shortly after the piece ran," he said. "The timing never sat right with me. 3 months after I turned down his first offer. Suddenly there's a piece in the paper about my negligence." "But you didn't investigate it," she said. He stopped. Started again. "I was not in a good place to investigate anything," he said. "And I didn't particularly care what Red Hollow thought of me." "Do you care now?" He looked at her steadily. "I care that you married a man the town considers." "I didn't marry the town's opinion of you," she said. I married you. Whether the town understands that you're not what they think you are matters to me, for reasons that are practical as well as personal." He was quiet for a moment. "What are the practical reasons?" he asked. "Neighbors who distrust you won't cooperate with you," she said. "And looking at this land, at these springs, at the location of this property relative to everything around it, you're going to need neighbors who cooperate with you before too long." "Why before too long?" "Because Vernon Pike wants this property badly enough to have destroyed your reputation to weaken you," she said. "He's going to try something else. He's patient, but he's not done." Something moved through Bramwell's expression. Not surprise exactly, but something like recognition, like she'd named a thing he'd been thinking in a language he hadn't been able to find. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to understand what happened to Maribel and Lucy," she said. "All of it. Everything you know. And then I want to talk to the doctor who was there." He was very still. "His name is Dr. Avery Hollis," he said. "He retired last year. He lives on the western edge of Red Hollow." "Good," she said. She set down her coffee mug. "Tomorrow," she said, "I need to go to town." Red Hollow looked at Elowen Thorne the way it had looked at Bramwell Thorne from the wagon, that particular quality of a small town's attention, which is different from curiosity and different from hostility and somewhere between the two, an awareness, a cataloging, a provisional judgment. She walked through it deliberately, because she was not a person who sidled. Dr. Hollis was not difficult to find. He was a compact man in his late 60s, who had been a frontier physician long enough to have lost his idealism, but retained his precision, and he answered his own door and looked at her without pretense. "I know who you are," he said before she stated her name. "You're the woman who married Bramwell Thorne." "That's right," she said. "May I come in?" He studied her for a moment. "That depends on what you want." "I want to know what you saw in the winter of 1883, she said, "when Bramwell came for you." A long pause. He opened the door wider and stepped back. What Dr. Hollis told her, over coffee at a kitchen table that had clearly hosted 1,000 difficult conversations, was this: Bramwell Thorne had arrived at his door in the early hours of a January morning after traveling on foot through a mountain snowstorm for something approaching 36 hours. He had frostbite on 3 fingers of his left hand. He had refused treatment until after he'd given the doctor the details of his wife's and daughter's conditions, and they were on their way back up the mountain. He went as soon as he understood, the doctor said. "I've thought about that winter many times in the years since." He went as soon as any reasonable person would have gone, given the information he had. The fever came on fast and disguised itself. By the time it was clear how serious it was, he stopped. He went immediately. "I am prepared to say so in writing." "Would you?" Elowen said. "I already prepared something," he said quietly. "After the newspaper piece ran, I prepared a letter to the editor." I was told he paused, with the expression of a man who still, years later, felt the shape of his own failure. "I was told it wouldn't be published, that the decision was final." Elowen put her hands flat on the table. "Who told you that?" "The editor at the time," Dr. Hollis said. "And he told me that the publisher had made the call." He looked at his coffee. "I later came to understand who the publisher was, through other channels. I'm sorry I didn't push harder." "You're pushing now," Elowen said. "That's what matters." She accepted the letter he'd already written, had clearly been waiting to give to someone, and wrote on to the next 2 homesteads she'd identified from the bundle of letters in the tack room. At both, she was given written statements without much urging. "We've been waiting for someone to ask," said the woman at the second homestead, a rancher's wife who'd known both Maribel and Bramwell, and had been too afraid of the town's collective opinion to speak up alone. "Most things worth doing are easier with company," Elowen said. She didn't tell Bramwell what she'd collected until she had what she needed. That took 4 more days, and 2 more trips to town, and one very uncomfortable conversation with the current editor of the Red Hollow Courier, who turned pale when she laid out, calmly and specifically, the timeline of events and the financial connections she'd been able to trace through land office records and a helpful clerk in Helena who responded to a written inquiry with a detailed answer. Vernon Pike had purchased majority interest in the Red Hollow Courier 6 months before Maribel and Lucy Thorne died. The unsigned piece about negligence had run 3 months after Bramwell turned down a purchase offer for his ranch. She laid this out for the editor in his office, with the same flat practicality she'd used to lay out cattle feed calculations with her father, and watched his face change shape several times before she was finished. What do you want, he asked. A retraction, she said. Written clearly, front page. The whole story, as accurately as it can now be reconstructed. Vernon Pike's financial interest in this paper is now a matter of public record, she said. Whatever he does in response to a correction will only confirm the story. He ran the retraction 2 weeks later. The week after it ran, the Red Hollow Courier was purchased from Vernon's silent holding company by a consortium of local businessmen who had been looking for an occasion to do exactly that. Vernon didn't know yet that his occasion had passed, but Elowen knew. She just didn't know not yet that it wouldn't be enough. Because on the afternoon the retraction ran, a rider arrived at the ranch with a notice from the county land office, and the notice described a water rights claim against the 3 springs on Thorne property, a claim filed 4 months ago through a lawyer in Helena by a company whose principal investor, buried 3 layers deep in the documentation, was a name she was starting to recognize like a splinter she couldn't stop pressing: Vernon Pike. She read the notice standing in the yard, with the mountains above her and the sound of Bramwell working in the barn, and she understood, with a cold clarity that settled into her bones like the January wind that had once closed a mountain pass, that this was going to be harder than a newspaper correction, and something in her not afraid, not defeated, but absolutely awake said, "Good. Let's find out what we're made of." The water rights notice sat on the kitchen table for 2 days before Elowen let herself touch it again. That wasn't weakness. It was the way she worked. She'd learned early that reading something important twice in the same emotional state only confirmed what you already felt, and what she needed wasn't confirmation of how angry she was. She needed to understand the document completely, which required a cooler head than the one she'd had standing in the yard when she first read it. On the 3rd morning, she sat down with it before Bramwell was awake, with fresh coffee and the first pale light coming through the east window, and she read every word. The claim was filed under the name Consolidated Range Resources, a company registered in Helena. The claim stated that the 3 springs on the Thorne property drew from an underground source that originated on public land to the north, and that Consolidated Range Resources had filed for prior appropriation rights on that source 7 months ago, before Elowen had even answered Box 14 in the Helena Weekly Gazette. Prior appropriation. First come, first served, according to Montana water law. She turned the notice over, looking at the courier's stamp on the back. Filed 4 months ago, she'd been at this ranch for 6 weeks, which meant Vernon Pike had started this particular mechanism before she'd arrived, before the newspaper retraction, possibly before Bramwell had even placed his advertisement, which meant this hadn't been a reaction to anything she'd done. This had been the next move in a game that had been running for years, and she'd walked into it mid-play. She heard Bramwell's door open and his footsteps in the hall, that particular rhythm she'd already memorized without meaning to, and she turned the notice back over to its front side and waited. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her sitting at the table with it. "You're reading it again," he said. "I'm reading it properly," she said. "Sit down. Tell me everything you know about where those springs come from." What he knew was considerable, because Bramwell Thorne had spent 12 years on this land paying the kind of attention to its water that people who didn't grow up on dry ground could never quite replicate. He sat across from her with his coffee and talked for almost an hour, which was more than she'd heard him say in any single stretch since she'd arrived, and she took notes on the back of a receipt she found in her apron pocket. The 3 springs, he explained, came from an aquifer that sat beneath the limestone shelf on the southern face of the upper mountain. He'd traced the general direction of flow himself, years ago after a wet spring, by watching where the ground stayed green longest during the dry months that followed. The water did not originate on public land to the north. It originated on the upper slope, which was part of his deeded property. "Can you prove that?" she asked. "Not with anything I have here," he said, "but a geological survey could establish it." "How much does a geological survey cost?" A pause. "More than we have readily available," he said. She tapped her pencil against the receipt. "What about the county land office records? Would the original survey of this property show anything useful?" "It might show the spring locations," he said. "It wouldn't necessarily show the source. But if the springs are marked as originating within your deeded boundary, it at least contradicts their claim," he said. He looked at her across the table. "You're thinking about the legal argument. I'm thinking about what we can establish without spending money we don't have," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. There's something else, he said. Tell me. 3 years ago, he said, a surveyor came through this valley. He said he was doing general county work. He asked permission to cross my property, which I gave him, and he spent about a half a day up on the north slope. Elowen stopped tapping the pencil. Did he show you any documentation? He had a county letter, Bramwell said. I didn't examine it closely. And you never heard anything further from the county about whatever he'd surveyed? Nothing, he said. She sat with that for a moment. What did he look like? Bramwell described a man middle height, precise mannerisms, a good horse, and then he said, almost as an afterthought, he had a letter of introduction from Vernon Pike. Said Pike had recommended him as reliable. The pencil stopped moving entirely. You didn't think that was worth mentioning before now? She said, keeping her voice carefully even. I didn't understand it was connected, he said. And then honestly, without defensiveness, I don't always make connections quickly. I see things carefully, but I'm not quick the way you are. Elowen looked at him. There was something uncomfortable about how straightforwardly he said that no apology, no self-pity, just a clean statement of a limitation, offered as information. She wasn't used to people doing that. All right, she said. The surveyor worked for Pike, or at minimum was sent by him, which means that survey, whatever it actually showed, may have been the basis for the water rights claim. A fraudulent basis, Bramwell said. Potentially, she said. We'd need to see the survey itself to know what it said. She stood up, carrying her coffee to the window. Outside, the morning light had reached the meadow, and the horses were moving along the fence line looking for the best grass. Everything looked calm. Nothing was. I need to go to Helena, she said. Bramwell said nothing for a moment. That's 3 days each way, he said. I know. The property, I know. She turned around. Is there someone who can look in while I'm gone? One of the neighboring ranchers you've helped over the years. He looked like he was going to argue with that, and then he didn't. Caleb Marsh, he said, 2 miles east, he'd do it. Good, she said. I'll leave in 2 days. That gives me time to write some letters first. She wrote 4 letters that afternoon. The first was to a lawyer in Helena named Edmund Price, whose name had appeared twice in documents she'd found in the county records during her earlier visits. He seemed to have a reputation for taking cases involving land disputes on something approaching a deferred fee arrangement. The second was to the county clerk's office in Helena, requesting a copy of any geological or hydrological surveys filed in the past 5 years for the township that included Red Hollow. The third was to her father. She hadn't written to her family since she arrived. She'd sent a brief message when she reached the ranch saying she'd arrived safely, and then she'd been too busy and too uncertain of what to say to write again. Now she wrote honestly, not alarming, but honest. She told him about the property, about Bramwell, about the situation developing around the water claim. She told him she was all right. She told him she thought she'd made the right choice, though it was turning out to be a more complicated one than she'd anticipated. She asked him to hold on with the homestead until the spring, and she told him why she thought that mattered. She sealed that one last and sat with it for a moment before she put it with the others. The fourth letter she wrote to a woman named Agnes Tully, who ran a boarding house in Red Hollow, and who Elowen had met briefly during one of her trips to town, a woman who had the particular quality of knowing everything about everyone without being malicious about it, which made her either useful or dangerous, depending on which side of her attention you were on. The letter asked a simple question: who, in Red Hollow, had been present at the land office when the water rights notice was filed, and who had witnessed it? She sent all 4 letters with a rider the following morning. Bramwell didn't say much the evening before she left for Helena, but he made sure the wagon was in good repair, that she had adequate supplies for the journey, and that the arrangement with Caleb Marsh was confirmed. He walked her out to the wagon in the early morning dark and checked the harness one more time while she was settling her bag behind the seat. "You're careful," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's not a criticism." She picked up the reins. "I'll be back in 6 days. 7 at the outside." He stood by the wagon wheel and looked at her with that careful measuring expression she was starting to understand was not distance. It was attention. "What you're doing," he said. "You don't have to." "I'm doing it because it needs doing," she said. "That's enough reason." "Elowen," she looked at him. "Be careful with Pike," he said. "He's patient. And he doesn't make mistakes the way people who act from anger make mistakes. He plans, so do I," she said. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, but something. She turned the horses onto the road. Helena, in late October, was cold and businesslike, and smelled of coal smoke and horse traffic, And Elowen arrived on the evening of her third day of travel, feeling the accumulated miles in her lower back and her patience in roughly equal measure. She found the boarding house Edmund Price's assistant had directed her to reasonable rate, clean, the kind of establishment run by a woman who understood that female travelers arriving alone were not a problem to be managed, but a clientele to be respected, and slept for 9 hours without waking. Edmund Price's office was on the second floor of a brick building 2 blocks from the courthouse, and he turned out to be a small, deliberate man in his 50s who wore spectacles and had the organized, unsentimental manner of someone who had spent decades sorting through other people's disasters. He read the water rights notice without comment. He read the notes she'd made from Bramwell's property records. He looked at the timeline she'd constructed between Vernon Pike's purchase of the newspaper interest and the filing of the water rights claim. "You've done most of this yourself," he said. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation. "I've had 6 weeks to pay attention," she said. "Tell me about the survey," he said. She told him about the surveyor who'd appeared 3 years ago with Vernon Pike's letter of introduction and the Luce County authorization, and she watched Price's expression shift in the small, precise way that lawyers' expressions shifted when they recognized something. "Can I find that survey in the county records here?" she asked. "If it was filed, yes," he said. "Not all surveys are filed. Some are kept private, used only for legal purposes by the party that commissioned them." "Would a private survey be admissible as the basis for a public water rights claim?" Price looked at her over his spectacles. "That," he said, "is an excellent question. The answer is complicated, and somewhat depends on who's sitting on the Territorial Water Board this year." He paused. "Who approached you about representation? How did you find my name?" "You appeared in several land records I reviewed," she said. "You seemed competent and honest. The second quality mattered more to me than the first." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." She did. It took the better part of 2 hours, and she didn't editorialize, just laid out the sequence of facts as she understood them, acknowledging clearly what she knew from documentation and what she was inferring from circumstance. When she finished, Price took off his spectacles and set them on the desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The water rights claim is vulnerable," he said. "The springs originate on your deed property, and I believe we can establish that from the original land survey and possibly from geological testimony. Then the prior appropriation filing has no valid basis. The source cannot be claimed as public when it isn't public." He paused. "But Consolidated Range Resources will contest it, and they will use Pike's resources to make the contest expensive and slow." "What about the survey?" she said. "The one the man did 3 years ago?" "I'll send someone to look for it," he said. "If it was filed under county records, we can access it. If it shows what I suspect it shows, that is, something that contradicts the water rights claim, then there's a question of how it was used in filing." He chose his next words carefully. "That would be a different kind of problem for Vernon Pike." "Fraud," she said. "Potentially," he said. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "What's your fee arrangement?" He quoted her something that was less than she'd feared and more than she had immediately available, and he said, without being asked, that he was willing to work on a deferred basis against the outcome of the water rights case, given the strength of what she'd brought him. She accepted, and they shook hands across the desk. The county records office was staffed by a clerk named Thomas, who was young and slightly overwhelmed by his own filing system, but who was genuinely helpful once Elowen made clear she knew exactly what she was looking for. It took most of the afternoon, but she found it, a survey filed under a general territorial assessment dated 3 years ago, covering the north slope of the mountain above Thorne Valley. She asked Thomas to make her a copy of the relevant pages. He did, and as he was handing them over, he said, "You know, there's a companion document to this survey that was filed separately. It's cross-referenced, see this notation here?" She looked at where he was pointing. The companion document, when Thomas retrieved it, was a private assessment attached to the survey by an addendum. It identified the underground source of the Thorne Valley Springs as located within the Thorne property boundary, clearly, unambiguously, in the surveyor's own hand, which meant that whoever had used this survey to support the Consolidated Range Resources water rights claim had either failed to read the addendum or had deliberately excluded it. She stood at the records counter for a moment, holding both documents. "I need certified copies of both," she said. "That'll take until tomorrow morning," Thomas said. "That's fine," she said. "I'll be here when you open." She left Helena on the morning of her 5th day with the certified copies in a leather document case that hadn't left her hands since Thomas passed it across the counter. Edmund Price had those documents now too, copies for his file, and was already preparing a formal response to the water rights claim. He'd also, at her request, sent an inquiry to the Territorial Licensing Board regarding the credentials of the surveyor, whose name appeared on the original assessment. She wanted to know exactly who had walked across Bramwell's North Slope with Vernon Pike's letter of introduction. The answer arrived by messenger just before she left. The surveyor was licensed and legitimate, which was interesting, because it meant whatever had happened to that addendum was a choice, not an accident. She stopped at the Helena postal office on her way out of town and found one reply waiting for her. Agnes Tully, from Red Hollow, had answered her 4th letter. Agnes wrote in a compact, precise hand that suggested someone who'd spent years saying more with less. 2 witnesses signed the water rights filing at the land office. One is a man named Deke Sorrelworks for Pike's freight operation out of Red Hollow. The second witness is Harlan Moss, who sits on the county water committee. Moss and Pike have had business dealings. I thought you'd want to know. Elowen folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket beside the document case and climbed onto the wagon. Harlan Moss on the county water committee. That changed the shape of things. The journey back took 3 days, and she spent most of it thinking rather than looking at the scenery, which was the kind of country that rewarded looking, but she didn't have the attention to spare. By the time the familiar outline of the ranch came into view on the afternoon of her 7th day, she had the rough architecture of a plan, not a complete plan. She wasn't someone who mistook an outline for a finished structure. But the main load-bearing elements were visible, and she understood what each of them required. Caleb Marsh's wagon was in the yard when she arrived, and Caleb himself was helping Bramwell replace a section of the corral gate, a big, quiet man with a gray-streaked beard who looked at her with the frank, assessing curiosity of someone who'd been hearing about Bramwell Thorne's new wife and hadn't made up his mind yet. Bramwell looked up when she drove in. He stopped working. He watched her climb down from the wagon with the document case, and she could see him reading the fact that she had it, and what that probably meant, and a tension in him that she recognized from the way he'd watched Vernon Pike ride away 2 weeks ago. A careful, contained alertness eased by about a degree. Not much. But measurably, this is Caleb, he said. I gathered, she said. She extended her hand to Caleb. Thank you for looking in. Caleb shook it with the studied gravity of a man deciding to respect someone. You're shorter than I expected, he said. Bramwell said you were formidable. He didn't say that, she said. He didn't have to, Caleb said. She glanced at Bramwell, who had gone back to the gate hinge, and was examining it with unnecessary thoroughness. Stay for coffee, she told Caleb. I need to talk to Bramwell, and it might be useful for you to hear some of it. She laid out what she'd found in Helena at the kitchen table, while Caleb sat with his coffee and the look of a man absorbing more than he'd expected when he agreed to stay. When she got to the addendum, the surveyor's own document establishing the spring's origin within Thorne property, she slid the certified copy across the table to Bramwell. He read it in silence, then he read it again. They had this, he said. The man who filed the claim had access to this, yes, she said. Whether Pike himself read it, I can't say. But someone made a decision to leave it out. Bramwell set the paper down on the table with very deliberate care, which told her more about what he was feeling than if he'd put his fist through the wall. Caleb picked it up and read it. When he set it down, he looked at Elowen with a different expression than the one he'd come in with. I want to tell you something, Caleb said. All right, she said. I've known Bramwell for 8 years, he said, since before Maribel and Lucy, and after they died. He stopped, seemed to decide something. After they died, when the town decided what they decided, I didn't say anything. I was angry about it, but I didn't say anything. Why are you saying it now, she asked. Because you came back from Helena with documents, he said. And because he looked at Bramwell. Because it's been 4 years and I owe you an apology, and I'm making it now in front of your wife, so someone else knows I made it. Bramwell looked at the table. I knew the newspaper piece wasn't right, Caleb said. I knew it, and I let it stand because I didn't know how to push against Vernon Pike without resources I didn't have. You have resources now, Elowen said quietly. Both men looked at her. Not money, she said. I know the water claim response is going to cost more than we have available. I know Price's deferred fee helps but doesn't solve it. She put her hands flat on the table. What I'm talking about is land knowledge, water access. The kind of thing that makes a legal argument mean something to a water committee. Caleb's eyes narrowed. You're thinking about the other ranchers, he said. I'm thinking about the fact that those springs don't only matter to this property, she said. During dry months, Bramwell has managed that water carefully enough that neighboring homesteads have had access to it, hasn't he? It wasn't quite a question. She'd read about it in the letters from the tack room. He has, Caleb said. If those springs come under outside control, she said, that changes for everyone in this valley. Caleb sat very still. How many families are we talking about, she asked. 7 homesteads within reasonable distance, Caleb said. Maybe 4 of them have depended on Bramwell's spring access at some point. Would they come to a meeting? If I asked them, Caleb said. Yes. She looked at Bramwell. He was watching her with that steady, measuring look she still hadn't entirely learned to read. A meeting, he said. Nothing dramatic, she said. Just neighbors talking about water. He nodded slowly. When? 2 weeks, she said. Give Price time to file the formal response, and give me time to understand what Harlan Moss on the water committee is actually afraid of. Caleb blinked. How are you going to find that out? Agnes Tully is going to help me, she said. She just doesn't know it yet. Caleb looked at Bramwell again. Bramwell looked back at him with the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by his wife approximately 1 week into their marriage. I'll make the rounds, Caleb said. He stood up, picked up his hat. 2 weeks. After Caleb left, the house got quiet in the way. It got quiet in the evenings. The natural rhythm of 2 people who'd figured out how to share space without grinding against each other. Bramwell washed the coffee cups. Elowen reviewed her notes at the table. Outside, the temperature was dropping, and the sound of the wind in the aspens came through the kitchen window where the seal needed attention. The seal on that window needs work, she said. It does, he said. I've been meaning to get to it. I can do it tomorrow if you tell me where the materials are. A pause. I'll show you in the morning. She looked up from her notes. He was standing at the dry sink, not quite turned toward her, and she recognized the particular quality of not quite turning. That meant he had something to say that he hadn't figured out how to approach yet. Say it, she said. He turned around, leaned against the counter. What you did in Helena, he said. What you're doing with Caleb and the other ranchers. He stopped. I need you to know that I understand what it's costing you. Time and energy, and it's costing us, she said. It's my problem too now. Legally, I'm not talking about legally, she said. I'm talking about what I decided when I came to this ranch. This is my home. She said it without dramatic weight, just as a fact. What happens to it happens to me. That's not a sacrifice. It's just arithmetic. He was quiet for a moment. You're not what I expected, he said. When I placed the advertisement, what did you expect? He considered it honestly. Someone more willing to wait and see, he said. Someone who'd need time to decide whether to trust the situation. I decided to trust you in the first 20 minutes, she said. Why? She thought about the coat, too big, smelling of wood smoke. She thought about the bedroll he'd given up without being asked. She thought about him sleeping on the cold ground of that traveler's shelter so she could have privacy. Because you made choices that cost you something, she said, without expecting credit for making them. He didn't say anything. She went back to her notes. The wind pushed against the window with the loose seal, and she added it to the list in her margin. Window, east kitchen, needs tending. It was a small thing. But she was learning that small things, properly tended, were how you held larger ones together. The reply from Agnes Tully about Harlan Moss arrived 4 days later, and it was more detailed than Elowen had hoped. Moss had served on the county water committee for 11 years. He had, 3 years ago, taken out a significant personal loan. Agnes did not specify the source, but she noted that the loan had been arranged through a Helena financial firm that Vernon Pike had documented ties to. The loan had been repaid within a year, in full, at a time when Moss's other known finances would not have supported it. Agnes ended the letter with a single sentence that was almost admirably understated. I thought you might find the timing of the repayment interesting, given the timing of the survey. Elowen read the letter twice, then walked out to the barn, where Bramwell was working with a young Horsa Bay mare that had come to him with a badly handled past and required the kind of patient, meticulous work that she'd noticed was the thing he did best. I need to go to Red Hollow, she said. He didn't look up from the mare's feet, which he was checking with careful attention. Today? Tomorrow morning, she said. I need to speak to Agnes Tully in person, and I need to pay another visit to Dr. Hollis. He set the mare's foot down gently. "Can I ask what you're building?" he said. She leaned on the barn door and looked at him. "A case that doesn't just win in a water committee," she said. "A case that makes it so the water committee doesn't matter." He straightened up and looked at her. "If Moss's vote on that committee is compromised," she said, "then any decision he participates in can be challenged. But more to the point, if Pike's pattern of behavior in this valley becomes something people can see all at once, rather than one piece at a time, the water claim becomes one item in a longer list. Lists are harder to dismiss than isolated incidents." Bramwell was quiet for a moment. "You want to make the whole thing visible," he said. "I want people to be able to see the whole wall," she said, "not just the individual bricks." He looked at her with that expression she'd been slowly learning to read, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but held something in it that she thought might, eventually, with time, become one. "Go to Red Hollow," he said. "I'll manage here." She nodded and went back to the house to write another letter to Edmund Price. Outside, the aspens had gone fully gold now, rattling in the afternoon wind, and somewhere above the tree line the first thin edge of winter was gathering itself, patient and unhurried, the way things that intend to stay always are. Agnes Tully's boarding house sat at the quieter end of Red Hollow's main street, between a harness shop that smelled permanently of leather oil and a small dry goods store whose owner had the habit of sweeping his front step at exactly 7 in the morning, regardless of weather. Elowen had noticed both on her earlier visits to town, and she noticed them again now as she tied the horse at the rail and went up the 3 steps to Agnes's front door. Agnes answered before she knocked twice, which meant she'd been watching from the front window, which meant she'd been expecting this visit. "I wondered when you'd come in person," Agnes said. She was a woman of about 50, wide-shouldered and observant, with the kind of face that had given up on performing expressions it didn't mean sometime around her 40th year. "Come in. I have coffee." The front parlor of the boarding house served as Agnes's informal office, sitting room, and intelligence gathering station, and it was clear she was comfortable with all 3 functions overlapping. She poured coffee with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times and sat across from Elowen without preamble. "You read my letter," Agnes said. "Several times," Elowen said. "I need to understand the Moss connection better. Not the general outline, I have that. I need to understand what he's afraid of." Agnes looked at her steadily. "Why does it matter what he's afraid of? You have the financial timing." "Because financial timing establishes what happened," Elowen said. "It doesn't tell me whether Moss made a choice willingly or was maneuvered into something he didn't fully understand. That difference matters for how he'll behave when this comes into the open." Agnes considered that. "You're trying to decide whether he's a villain or a fool," she said. "I'm trying to decide whether he's recoverable," Elowen said. That landed. Agnes picked up her coffee and turned it in her hands. "Most people would want him punished. Most people aren't trying to win a water rights case before winter closes the mountain passes," Elowen said. "I don't have time for what most people want. I have time for what works." Agnes was quiet for a moment in the way of someone's revising their estimate of who they were talking to. Then she said, "Harlan Moss has a son, 22 years old. The boy made some poor decisions about 3 years ago involving a card game and a man who turned out to be connected to Pike's freight operation. The debt was substantial." Elowen set her cup down very carefully. "And the debt was resolved," she said, "around the same time as the personal loan." "The same month," Agnes said. "I couldn't put that in a letter. Too specific to put in writing." "No," Elowen agreed. "It wasn't foolishness. It was his son." She sat with that for a moment. "Has Moss ever shown any sign of wanting out of whatever arrangement Pike has him in?" Agnes tilted her head slightly. "There was a water committee meeting last spring. A routine matter. Nothing to do with Thorne Valley. Moss voted against a Pike-connected interest, which surprised people who were paying attention. The vote didn't change anything. It was 3-2 and Moss was on the losing side, but he voted against." "A test," Elowen said, "or a signal, or a mistake," Agnes said. "Hard to say from the outside." Elowen picked her cup back up. "What does Moss care about besides his son, his reputation?" Agnes said. "He's been on that committee for 11 years. He came up through hard work and he knows the difference between what he was and what he's become in the last 3. She paused. "He's not a happy man." "No," Elowen said. "I imagine he isn't." She found Dr. Hollis at the same kitchen table where they'd talked before, and he looked like he'd been thinking about her visit before she arrived. 2. There was a manila envelope already sitting on the table beside the coffee, things that hadn't been there in her memory of this kitchen. "I've been collecting additional material," he said before she'd sat down. "Since you came the first time." She looked at the envelope. "What kind of material?" "Statements," he said, "from 3 other families who Bramwell helped during difficult winters. I contacted them myself." He said this with the careful, slightly uncomfortable manner of a man making a delayed payment on a debt. "I should have done it years ago." "I didn't." Elowen didn't reassure him. "May I see them?" He pushed the envelope across the table. The statements were written in different hands, varying degrees of education visible in the prose, but consistent in their content. A horse left overnight when a foal was in trouble. Provisions delivered without announcement during a hard January. A fence rebuilt after a windstorm when the neighboring family had been too sick to manage it. 4 years of quiet, invisible competence that had never been acknowledged because the town had decided what Bramwell Thorne was and stopped looking at what he actually did. She read each one carefully and put them back in the envelope. "These are good," she said. "I'm going to send copies to our lawyer in Helena." "There's something else," Dr. Hollis said. She looked up. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man assembling words he'd been turning over for a while. "The newspaper piece," he said. "The one from '84. When I tried to have my letter published and was refused, I kept a record of that conversation, written down, that same evening, because I had a feeling I might need it." Elowen went very still. "You wrote down what the editor told you," she said. "What he told me, and what he told me specifically about who had made the decision to block publication." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded page, worn at the creases but intact. "I wrote it in my medical journal because I trusted myself not to lose a medical journal. The page has the date at the top. It's in my own hand." She took it from him and read it. The editor's name, the specific language he'd used, and at the bottom a name, Pike V. "Publication blocked at P's specific instruction per editor's direct statement." She looked up at Dr. Hollis. "Why didn't you use this before?" she asked. Not accusatory, she genuinely wanted to know. He met her eyes. "Because I'm an old man who was afraid," he said, "and because there was no one asking the right questions." He paused. "You're asking the right questions." She folded the page along its worn creases and held it with both hands. "I need a certified copy of this," she said, "and the original needs to go somewhere safe." "I'll file the original with the county clerk in Helena," he said. "I should have done it 3 years ago." "You're doing it now," she said. "That's what matters for our purposes." She was at the dry goods store buying supplies for the ride back when the bell above the door announced another customer, and she looked up and found Vernon Pike standing 3 feet away, examining a display of leather gloves with the relaxed attention of a man who had nowhere he needed to be. He looked up at the same moment and smiled with the warmth of someone who had practiced making warmth look effortless. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. "What a coincidence." It was not a coincidence. She understood that immediately and filed it without reacting to it. "Mr. Pike," she said. "I heard you've been busy," he said pleasantly. "Helena and back. Making visits around town." He picked up one of the gloves, examined the stitching. "You've been married, what, 7 weeks now? 8? Something like that," she said. "And already managing your husband's legal affairs." He set the glove down. "That's quite an undertaking for someone who only just arrived in the valley." "Someone has to do it," she said. "He's better with horses." A flicker of something behind the pleasant expression. "I like you," he said. "I want you to know that. You're direct. I appreciate that in a person." "I appreciate it too," she said, "which is why I'll be direct with you now. The water rights claim is going to fail, Mr. Pike. The springs originate on deeded Thorne property. We have the survey addendum that establishes it. We have legal representation in Helena preparing a formal challenge. And we have questions being asked about the process by which the original claim was filed." The glove display occupied his attention again, briefly. "Legal proceedings take time," he said, "and money. How are you planning to fund a legal challenge over a Montana winter?" "I'll manage," she said. "Will Bramwell manage?" He looked at her then, and for the first time the pleasantness moved aside enough that she could see what was behind it. Not exactly menace, but a flat, patient calculation. He's had a difficult several years. Another drawn-out fight, legal bills, the stress of it, neighbors with their own difficulties. "Are you threatening my husband's mental stability in a dry goods store?" she said, keeping her voice absolutely level. A pause. He smiled again. "I'm expressing concern," he said. "For a man I've known for years. You've known him long enough to finance a newspaper piece that blamed him for his wife and daughter's deaths, she said. Your concern is noted. Something changed in his face. Small but real. She'd landed something. I don't know what you think you found. He started. I know what I've found, she said. I have documentation. I have testimony. I have a record of a conversation between your editor and the physician who treated Bramwell Thorne, in which your editor stated that you personally blocked publication of the doctor's rebuttal. She kept her voice conversational, as if she were discussing the weather. I'm not telling you this to threaten you. I'm telling you because you're a man who plans, and I think you should plan with accurate information. He was very still. Withdraw the water rights claim, she said. Do it through your lawyers. Make it look procedural if you want, but do it within the next 30 days. In exchange, we'll focus our legal efforts exclusively on the water issue and not pursue the newspaper matter publicly. And if I don't, he said quietly, then we pursue everything, she said. All at once, the water claim, the survey, the newspaper, the committee. She picked up her parcel from the counter. Good afternoon, Mr. Pike. She walked out. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the horse. She stood for a moment with her back to the street, holding the reins, and made herself breathe until the shaking stopped. Then she mounted up and rode out of Red Hollow at a pace that was not quite a hurry, but was not casual either. She told Bramwell that evening. All of it, Agnes, doctor. Hollis's journal entry, the encounter with Pike in the dry goods store. She told it in sequence, the way she'd taken notes, and she watched his face move through the things it moved through while she talked, the controlled stillness when she described the journal entry, something harder when she got to the dry goods store, and then when she described what she'd said to Vernon Pike, a long quiet. You told him to withdraw or we'd pursue everything, he said. Yes. Can we pursue everything, he said. Do we have the resources to mines? Price believes the water claim challenge can be won on the survey addendum alone, she said. The rest, the newspaper, the committee those, are more complicated and more expensive. But Pike doesn't know exactly where our resources end. She paused. He's a man who calculates risk. I wanted to change his calculation. Bramwell looked at the table for a moment. You negotiated with him, he said. I made an offer, she said. He didn't accept it. He didn't refuse it either. He went very quiet, which in a man like that means he's running numbers. And if he doesn't withdraw, then we fight on all fronts and it will be hard and expensive. And we may not win everything, she said. But we fight. He was quiet for a long time. The fire had settled into coals, and the only sound was the wind outside and the occasional shift of a horse in the corral. Elowen, he said finally. Yes. I need to tell you something. She waited. When I placed that advertisement, he said, I was trying to solve a practical problem. I needed someone who could manage the household, and I needed it to be someone permanent. I was not thinking about, he stopped. I was not thinking about offering anything beyond that. What I had left after Maribel and Lucy wasn't something I thought was worth offering to anyone. She looked at him. I'm telling you this because you have been doing things, for this property, for my name, that go far beyond what any practical arrangement would require. He met her eyes. And I don't know how to balance that account. It's not an account, she said. To me, it feels like one. Then stop keeping it, she said. I'm not doing this because I expect something in return. I'm doing it because it's right, and because this is my home, and because, she paused, choosing her words with care, because I have met exactly 3 people in my life who tell the truth without calculating whether it costs them something. And you're one of them, and that is not a common thing, Bramwell. It's worth fighting for. He looked at her for a long moment. 3 people, he said. My youngest brother, she said. Dr. Hollis. And you. Something moved through his face that she couldn't quite name, something old and stiff, like a door that hadn't been opened in years trying to move on its hinges. He nodded once, looked at the fire. She let it be. The meeting Caleb had arranged happened on a Saturday at the Marsh homestead because it was the largest of the properties and the most central. Elowens had spent the intervening days preparing not a speech, but a series of facts, organized in the order she thought would be most useful, and she discussed it with Bramwell the night before until they'd agreed on what to include and what to hold back. 7 families came. Some Elowen had met in passing during her trips to Red Hollow. Some she hadn't met at all. They came with the wariness of people who had been managing their own difficult situations and weren't sure they had energy to take on someone else's. Caleb opened it simply. Elowen Thorne asked for this meeting, he said. I think you should hear what she has to say before you decide what you think about it. She stood up. She didn't apologize for taking their time. She'd noticed that people who started that way either didn't believe in what they were saying or were trying to preemptively soften a refusal, and she wasn't doing either. Consolidated Range Resources has filed a water rights claim on the springs that feed Thorne Valley, she said. The claim is fraudulent. I can demonstrate that with documented evidence. But it will take time and legal effort to defeat it, and in the meantime, if the claim is not challenged properly, it creates a precedent for water source claims throughout this township. A man she didn't know, seated near the window, said, That's Thorne land. What's it got to do with us? The same aquifer that feeds the Thorne Springs runs beneath this valley, she said. The geological survey evidence we've obtained shows the source extends under properties beyond the Thorne boundary. Consolidated Range Resources filed a prior appropriation claim on the public land above, but the real target is the aquifer. She looked at him directly. If they establish the precedent, they come for your water next. The room got quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something abstract becomes concrete. Who's behind Consolidated Range Resources? Another man asked. A woman, actually a rancher's wife from the eastern edge of the valley, older than Elowen by 20 years, with the look of someone who had survived enough bad winters to stop being impressed by threats and start being impressed only by facts. Vernon Pike, Elowen said. The name moved through the room. He's also behind the newspaper piece from 4 years ago, she said. The one that blamed Bramwell for his family's deaths. She said it plainly, because that was the only way to say it. I have documentation establishing that Pike financed the publication that ran the story and personally ordered the rejection of a rebuttal from the physician who treated Bramwell Thorne. We can establish a pattern of deliberate efforts to force this ranch out of Bramwell's ownership. Bramwell was sitting near the wall, not at the table, which she'd asked him to do, because she'd noticed that people listened to her differently when he wasn't the center of the room. She could see him from where she stood, and she saw his jaw tighten slightly when she said it. Not at the content, which he knew, but at hearing it said aloud in front of people. Why did he want the ranch? The woman from the eastern edge asked. The springs, Elowen said. The location. The freight route that's coming through this territory in the next several years will need reliable water sources. This valley has the best natural water access within 30 miles. She paused. The ranch is worth significantly more than it was when Pike started trying to acquire it. That number will only grow. The man near the window said, What do you want from us? Testimonies, she said. Written statements about your use of the Thorne Springs during dry months when you access them, with what understanding, over what period of time. That establishes a history of community use that complicates any attempt to privatize the source. And what else? The woman asked. Because she heard, as smart people do, that there was something else. A cooperative water agreement, Elowen said. Formal. Documented. Between the families in this valley, sharing access and responsibility for the springs and the channels that carry water from them. She waited a moment. If the water is managed communally under a formal agreement, it becomes significantly harder for an outside party to claim exclusive rights to it. Cooperative water use is recognized under territorial law. You've done your reading, Caleb said from his seat at the end of the table. I've had reasons to, she said. A long silence followed, the kind that wasn't hostile but was real people thinking, rather than reacting, which she respected. Then the woman from the eastern edge said, My husband and I have used Bramwell Spring twice in the last 3 years, during dry Julies. He never asked for anything in return, and he never made us feel like we owed him. That's accurate, Bramwell said from the wall. It was the first thing he'd said, and the room shifted slightly toward him when he spoke. I never kept records of it. I probably should have. That changes today, Elowen said, if everyone here is willing. It wasn't unanimous. 2 of the 7 families said they needed to think about it, which was honest, and she told them that was fine and to send word to Caleb when they'd decided. The other 5 agreed before the meeting ended. The days that followed had the particular texture of hard work that doesn't show its results immediately, but that builds something real beneath the surface. Elowen wrote letters to Edmund Price every 3 days with updates. She collected written testimonies from the 5 families who'd agreed, then from a 6th who came back after a week with a sheepish expression and a signed statement. She helped Bramwell draft the preliminary cooperative water agreement, which Price would need to formalize, working at the kitchen table in the evenings until the lamp oil ran low. She also waited for Vernon Pike's response to what she'd said in the dry goods store. It came in a form she hadn't anticipated. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the Red Hollow confrontation, a man arrived at the ranch on foot, not on horseback, which was unusual enough in this country that she noticed it before she noticed anything else about him. He was perhaps 40, plainly dressed, and he stopped at the gate and called out, rather than approaching, which was either courtesy or caution. "I'm looking for Mrs. Thorne," he said. Bramwell was in the barn. Elazin was at the woodpile. She set down the splitting maul and walked to the gate. "I'm Elowen Thorne," she said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "I was asked to bring this directly to you," he said. "Not through the mail. Personally." She took it. "Who asked you?" He hesitated. "Someone who said to tell you that Harlan Moss regrets several things," he said, "and that this letter explains which ones." He tipped his hat and walked back up the road the way he'd come. She stood at the gate and looked at the envelope for a moment, then walked to the fence post and leaned against it and opened it there, in the cold morning air, rather than waiting. The letter was 4 pages in a careful, slightly cramped hand. It was from Harlan Moss. He wrote about his son first, which she'd expected, the card game debt, the amount, the fear that the boy would be physically harmed if the debt wasn't resolved. The approach from a man he now understood was acting for Pike's interests. He wrote about what he'd been asked to do in exchange: support the water rights filing through the committee process, smooth the procedural path. He had done it. He wrote that plainly, without self-justification. He had done it because he was afraid for his son, and he had spent 3 years since doing it knowing that it had been wrong. He had voted against a Pike-connected motion last spring, he wrote, to see if he could, to see if there would be consequences. There hadn't been, which meant either Pike wasn't watching that closely, or Pike had considered it small enough to ignore. He was willing to provide a written statement, notarized, describing his role in the water committee process and the circumstances under which he'd been induced to participate. He was not willing to do it unless he had assurance that his son's name would not appear in any public proceeding. She read it twice, then folded it and put it inside her coat. Bramwell's was watching from the barn doorway. She walked toward him across the yard. "We need to write to Price today," she said. "What was in the letter?" "A confession," she said, "and a condition." He waited. "The condition is reasonable," she said. "His son's name stays out of it. We can do that without compromising the legal case. We need Moss's statement about the committee process, not the specific mechanism Pike used to secure it. Can Price protect that?" "I think so," she said. "But I want his confirmation before I respond to Moss." Bramwell nodded slowly. "This changes things." "Significantly," she said. She stopped in front of him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The cold had come down off the mountain overnight, and her breath was visible in the morning air. "I keep thinking about Vernon Pike in that store," Bramwell said. "What you said to him." "Which part?" she said. "The part about documentation," he said. "About the journal entry. When you said that, what did he do?" "He went still," she said. "Very still. The way a man goes still when he realizes the ground has shifted under him, and he doesn't know yet by how much." Bramwell looked out across the yard. "I should have fought him years ago," he said. "You were grieving," she said, "and you were alone. Those aren't excuses. They're just what was true." "You're not alone," he said, and he said it like a simple observation of fact, the way he said most things. "No," she said. "Neither are you." A horse called from the corral, the bay mare, the one he'd been working with, who had started to trust the sound of his footsteps. Bramwell looked toward the sound automatically, the way a person looks toward something they're responsible for. "I need to work with the mayor this morning," he said. "I know," she said. "Go. I'll write to Price." Price's response came 6 days later, and it was what she'd hoped. The Moss statement could be incorporated into the water rights challenge, without naming the specific inducement mechanism, framing it instead as testimony regarding procedural irregularities in the committee's review process. The son's name would not appear. She wrote to Harlan Moss the same afternoon. While she waited for his notarized statement, another letter arrived. This one from Edmund Price with different news, and this one she read standing at the kitchen window for a long time before she set it down. Consolidated Range Resources had filed an amended claim, not a withdrawal, an amendment. They had altered the geographic scope of the claim, reducing it significantly, pulling back from the areas where the survey addendum most clearly contradicted their original filing. He's retreating, Caleb said when she told him. He'd come by to deliver 2 additional testimonies from families in the valley and had stayed for the news. Partially, she said. He's reducing his exposure on the survey issue. But the core claim is still there. What does Price think? That it's a negotiating posture, she said. Pike is testing whether we'll accept a partial withdrawal and call it a victory. Will you? Caleb asked. Bramwell, who'd been listening from the doorway, said no. Both Caleb and Elowen looked at him. It was the definitiveness of it, the single syllable with no qualification attached. A partial withdrawal leaves a partial claim, Bramwell said. A partial claim can be expanded again later under different circumstances. Once Pike is out of the water on this property, he should be completely out. Elowen looked at him. That's exactly right, she said. Caleb looked between the two of them, with the expression of a man watching something that had taken its time arriving, finally get where it was going. All right, he said. So what's the next move? The next move, Elowen said, is to make the complete picture visible. Not just to a water committee, to Red Hollow. The town meeting, Caleb said. The town meeting, she confirmed. All of it, the original newspaper piece. The survey. The committee. The pattern. She looked at her notes. I want people to see the whole wall. She'd said that phrase to Bramwell weeks ago, in the barn doorway. He hadn't forgotten it. She could see from his expression that he remembered exactly when she'd said it. Pike will know it's coming, Caleb said. He has people in town who'll tell him. I'm counting on it, Elowen said. I want him to know. I want him to make a decision before the meeting about whether to be there or not. And if he's there? She thought about the dry goods store. The way his expression had shifted when she named Doctor. Hollis's journal entry, the way he'd gone very still. If he's there, she said, then the room will see how a man behaves when the complete truth is laid out in front of him. And if he's not there, the room will see that too, Bramwell said. Yes, she said, it will. Outside, the aspens had lost the last of their gold and stood bare-limbed against the gray November sky, the mountains above them already white from the first snowfall of the season. The same winter that had taken Maribel and Lucy, that had closed the passes and broken Bramwell Thorne's life into the shape it had held for 4 years, was coming back around again. This time, Elowen thought, looking at the white line of the peaks above the tree line, we'll be ready before it arrives. She picked up her pen. There was still a great deal of work to do. Harlan Moss's notarized statement arrived on a Thursday, 9 days after Elowen had sent her reply agreeing to his condition. She opened it at the kitchen table while Bramwell was outside, and she read it standing up because she'd sat down to read too many documents in the past weeks, and her back had opinions about it. The statement was 6 pages, written in the same careful cramped hand as the letter, and it was more detailed than she'd expected. Moss had apparently decided that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it completely. He described the approach, the specific language used, the name of the man who'd made the offer on Pike's behalf, the dates of the committee meetings, where he'd smoothed the procedural path for the water rights filing, and the precise nature of what had been asked of him at each stage. He had also, without being asked, included a brief paragraph at the end, stating that his vote the previous spring against the Pike-connected motion had been deliberate, that he had been trying to establish, for his own conscience if nothing else, that he still had the capacity to choose differently. She read that paragraph twice. Then she put the statement in the document case, with the survey addendum and Dr. Hollis's journal page and the certified Helena records, and she walked outside to find Bramwell. He was at the corral with the bay mare. The same patient, repetitive work he did every morning, moving around the horse in slow, measured circles, letting the animal track him without pressure. He'd told her once briefly that most horse problems were trust problems, wearing different clothes, and she'd thought about that more than once in the weeks since. Moss came through, she said, from the fence. He stopped moving. The mare watched him stop and then went back to the hay. Everything we needed, he asked. More than we needed, she said. He named the man Pike used to approach him. Bramwell came to the fence. Who? A man called Deke Sorrell, she said. The same name Agnes mentioned. Pike's freight man. Sorrell's been in this valley 3 times in the past year, Bramwell said. I thought he was scouting freight routes. He may have been doing that too, she said. He's apparently good at doing 2 things at once. Bramwell looked at the document case in her hand. When are you planning to go to Red Hollow? Saturday, she said. Caleb has the meeting arranged for Saturday afternoon. The town hall. She paused. I want you there. He looked at her. I know you don't want to be at the center of it, she said. I know it's not how you're built. But it matters that you're in that room. Not speaking, necessarily. Just present. Red Hollow has been carrying a story about you for 4 years. And part of what breaks that story is people seeing you with their own eyes, rather than through what the newspaper told them to see. He was quiet for a long moment. The mare moved behind him, and he heard it and shifted slightly, without looking adjustment, so automatic it wasn't conscious. "All right," he said. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "Unless you want to." "I'll want to," he said. "I just don't know yet what it'll be." She accepted that. She'd learned, in the 10 weeks they'd been married, that Bramwell's not knowing was almost always temporary, and that what came after it was worth waiting for. She spent the 2 days before the meeting in a kind of concentrated, grinding preparation that she recognized from her childhood. The way her father had prepared for difficult seasons, checking and rechecking what he had against what he needed, looking for the gaps. She organized the documents in the order she intended to present them. She wrote a brief outline for herself, not a script, because she'd never been able to work from a script. She needed the structure of what she was going to say, but the specific words had to be live, had to respond to the room. She also wrote a letter to her family, not about the meeting. She'd told them enough in previous letters about the water situation and the legal process. This letter was different. It was an attempt to say something she'd been turning over. Since the evening she'd told Bramwell about the 3 people she'd known who told the truth without calculating the cost. She told her father that she'd made the right choice. Not a comfortable choice. It had been, and continued to be, genuinely hard, in the practical ways that mattered, money and distance and uncertainty. But she said, and meant it, that she'd found something she hadn't expected to find, which was a life that made sense to her. She said that she had married a man who was not easy to know quickly, but who, once known, turned out to be built of something she respected. She said she was learning what it was to fight for something, rather than just endure something. She sealed it and put it with the other outgoing male, and then sat for a while at the kitchen table doing nothing in particular, which was unusual enough that Bramwell, passing through, stopped in the doorway. "You all right?" he said. "Thinking," she said. "About Saturday?" "About everything," she said. "About how we got here." He came in and sat down across from her, not with the deliberate formality he'd had in the early weeks, that careful maintenance of distance, but with the ease of someone who'd decided the table was available to him. "I've been thinking about that too," he said. "And?" He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "When I placed the advertisement," he said, "I told myself I was being practical, that I needed someone to help manage the ranch, and that the other things didn't apply to me anymore." He looked at the mug. "What I didn't account for was that someone practical enough to help manage the ranch would also be practical enough to see everything else." "Is that a complaint?" she said. "No," he said. He stopped. Started again. "I'm trying to say that I underestimated what I was asking for when I placed that advertisement. You asked for someone with practical disposition," she said. "That's what you got." "I asked for someone I could live alongside," he said quietly. "I didn't know. I was asking for someone who would change what living looked like." She looked at him across the table. She thought about what to say, and then decided to say the honest thing rather than the careful thing. "I didn't know that either," she said. "When I wrote back to Box 14, I was solving a problem. I've had to revise what I thought I was doing several times since." "Revised it to what?" he asked. She considered. "Building something," she said, "rather than just surviving something." He nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd suspected but needed to hear stated plainly. Outside, the first snow of a serious winter was beginning to fall. Not the light earlier dustings, but the real thing, coming down steady and intentional. They could both hear the change in the wind. "The pass will close in a week," he said. "Maybe 2. I know," she said. "Saturday is important." "Saturday will work," he said. And there was something in how he said it, a certainty she recognized as coming not from optimism, but from the same place his patience with the horses came from. A willingness to stay with something until it resolved. She picked up her pen. There was still the outline to finish. Saturday came with clear, cold air and a sky the flat white of old tin, the kind of winter sky that reflected light without warmth. Elowen dressed practically her good dress, which was not decorative but was presentable, and her coat and her boots, which were broken in enough to be reliable. She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand and did not particularly like or dislike what she saw, which was about what she aimed for in general. Bramwell was already at the wagon when she came out. He'd brushed his coat, she noticed. He was wearing the better of his 2 hats. He didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. But she noticed it the way she noticed most things he did without comment, stored it, let it mean what it meant. They picked up Caleb at his turnoff, and the three of them rode into Red Hollow with the particular silence of people who have prepared as much as preparation allows and are now in the interval between preparation and event, where there is nothing left to do but arrive. The town hall was already filling when they got there. Elowen had not expected the turnout. Caleb had, apparently. He looked unsurprised by the rows of chairs that were filling steadily with people she recognized, and many she didn't. Red Hollow in November had limited entertainment, and word of what the meeting was about had clearly traveled through the kinds of channels that word travels through in small communities, which is to say all of them, simultaneously, and faster than anyone intends. Agnes Tully was near the back, seated with the composed attention of someone who has arranged many things and is content to watch them unfold. She met Elowen's eyes briefly and gave a small nod. Dr. Hollis was near the front, which surprised Elowen until she thought about it and understood. The doctor had been waiting a long time to be in this room. Harlan Moss was not present. She'd told him in her reply that his physical presence wasn't required. His statement would speak for him. Vernon Pike was not present either. She absorbed that fact as she set her document case on the table at the front of the room and organized her papers. She had not allowed herself to form a firm prediction about whether he'd come. She'd told Caleb she was counting on him, knowing the meeting was happening, and she was, but whether that knowledge would produce the confrontation of a man who wanted to demonstrate he had nothing to fear or the absence of one who had calculated the risk and decided against it, she hadn't known. Now she knew. She wasn't sure yet whether it helped her hurt. Caleb called the room to order at 2 in the afternoon, which took a few minutes because rooms like this in towns like this had their own rhythm about when order actually arrived, and fighting that rhythm was foolish. Then he said, "Elowen Thorne has called this meeting. I've seen what she's going to present. I think it matters to everyone in this room. I'll leave it to her." She stood up. 4 years ago, she said, the Red Hollow Courier ran a piece blaming Bramwell Thorne for the deaths of his wife and daughter. I'm going to tell you what that piece was, where it came from, and what the full record shows. I'm asking you to listen to all of it before you form an opinion, because I've learned in the past 10 weeks that this story looks very different depending on how much of it you can see at once. The room was quiet, the particular quiet of people who have come with one set of expectations and are adjusting them in real time. She started with Dr. Hollis's account. She read it in his own words, from his signed statement, and she read it plainly without theatrical emphasis, because the plain facts were dramatic enough on their own. A man arriving frostbitten at a doctor's door at 3 in the morning after 36 hours on foot in a Montana blizzard, refusing treatment until he'd communicated his wife's and daughter's conditions. A physician who understood, in the moment and in the years since, that Bramwell Thorne had done what any reasonable man would have done given what he knew. Then she described the newspaper piece. She read the headline. She read the key passages that had constituted the accusation. She named the fact that the piece was unsigned and cited no witnesses. "I want to read you something," she said. "This is a written record made the same evening that Dr. Hollis attempted to submit a rebuttal to the Red Hollow Courier." She read the journal entry. She read the name of the editor who had refused the rebuttal. She read the final line, "Pike v. Publication blocked at P's specific instruction per editor's direct statement." The room moved. Not loudly. It was more like a shift in atmospheric pressure, the kind you feel in your ears before a storm. People who had been sitting with the comfortable, settled certainty of a fact they'd held for 4 years, feeling that certainty become unstable under them. She gave them a moment. Then she moved to the water rights claim. She explained consolidated range resources, the prior appropriation filing, the survey, and she held up the certified copy of the survey addendum, the one the original claim had omitted, the surveyor's own hand establishing that the spring source lay within Thorne property. The man who commissioned that survey, she said, was the same man who blocked the rebuttal to the newspaper piece, the same man who approached Bramwell multiple times about purchasing this ranch. The same man who, according to a sworn statement I have in this document case, used a third party to induce a member of the County Water Committee to support the water rights filing in exchange for resolving a private debt. The room was very still now. "I'm not going to read you the committee member's name," she said. "His statement is part of our legal filing, with Edmund Price in Helena, and it will go before the Territorial Water Board. His identity will become known through that process in due course. But I am telling you that the statement exists, that it's notarized, and that it describes in specific detail how the water rights claim against Thorne Valley was maneuvered through the committee process. She stopped. She looked at the room. Vernon Pike has filed an amended claim, she said. Not a withdrawal. An amendment that reduces the geographic scope, but preserves the core of what he's claiming. He has not responded to a direct offer to settle this matter privately. She paused. I want this community to understand what has been done in this valley over the past several years, and I want you to understand it completely. Not because I'm asking for anything, but because the people in this room deserve to make decisions about their water, their land, and their community with accurate information. She sat down. There was a silence that lasted several seconds and felt longer. Then the woman from the eastern edge of the valley, the one who'd been at Caleb's meeting, the one who'd said Bramwell, had never made her feel she owed him anything, said from her seat near the middle of the room. Is Bramwell here? I'm here, Bramwell said, from the chair along the wall. She turned to look at him directly. I want to say something to you, she said, in front of these people. A pause. My husband and I used your spring in the July of '85 and the July of '87. Both times you told us to come back if we needed it. Both times you didn't mention it afterward. Another pause. I believed what the paper said about you. For 4 years I believed it, and I had reason to know better because I'd seen how you behaved when it cost you something. She stopped. I'm sorry for that. It wasn't a dramatic speech. It was short and direct and clearly cost her something to say, which was exactly what made it land. Bramwell looked at her. He said, thank you. 2 words. But the room heard them. Then a man near the back Simeon Elowen didn't know, a rancher from the look of him, older than Caleb, said, What do we do about the water claim? Our legal challenge is already filed, Elowen said. The survey addendum makes a strong case. What would strengthen it further is community testimony about historical water use in this valley, formal documentation of how these springs have functioned as a community resource. You're talking about the cooperative agreement, Caleb said. Yes, she said. We've had 6 families sign on. More is better. You'll have more by Monday, the older rancher said. And several heads around the room moved in the way that wasn't quite a nod, but was agreement. It didn't feel like a triumph. She wasn't built for the feeling of triumph, particularly. It felt like a door opening, like a room that had been sealed for 4 years was finally getting air. But there was something else she needed to do before the meeting ended. One more thing, she said, and stood up again. The room settled. Bramwell has managed the water on this property alone for 12 years, she said. He's done it carefully, and the valley has benefited from that, even when the valley wasn't inclined to acknowledge it. She paused. A cooperative agreement formalizes what has already been happening. But a cooperative agreement requires that we think together about what this valley needs over the next 10 years. Not just this winter, not just the legal case. Water channels that need maintenance, dry season rotation, access roads that carry shared traffic. She looked at the room. What I'm proposing is not just a legal document. It's a decision to manage this resource together. I'm inviting anyone who wants to be part of that conversation to come to our ranch in 2 weeks. Caleb said from his seat, I'll be there. So will I, said the woman from the eastern edge. The older rancher near the back said nothing, but he looked at Bramwell with a direct evaluating look, and Bramwell looked back. And something passed between them that was neither apology nor forgiveness exactly, but was the beginning of a negotiation between 2 practical men who had both been wrong about something and were deciding to move forward anyway. They left Red Hollow as the afternoon light was going, the cold coming down fast the way it did in November in this part of Montana, the sky darkening at its edges with the particular blue of a clear winter evening. Caleb rode with them as far as his turnoff. When he split off, he said, without looking at either of them, you did what needed doing. Both of you. Then he was gone up his road, and they were alone on the wagon, with the mountains above them and the ranch 2 miles ahead. Neither of them spoke for a while. The horses knew the way home. They always did. Bramwell spoke first, and what he said was not what she expected. The woman who apologized, he said. Clara Hendricks. Is that her name? She and her husband were at Maribel's burial, he said. They were among the people who stood a little apart. I noticed at the time. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't expect that. People surprise you, Elowen said. Not usually, he said. You surprised me. She looked at the road ahead. Was it enough? He said. What happened in there? Is it enough to It's enough to change what people believe, she said. Whether it's enough to change everything that follows, the water case, Pike's next move, I don't know yet. Probably not on its own. She paused. But I told you weeks ago that I wanted people to see the whole wall. They saw it today, he said. They did. The ranch came into view around a long curve. The barn, the corral, the house with its plain lines against the mountain behind it. The bay mare called from the corral when she heard the wagon, which made Bramwell's mouth do the thing it did that wasn't quite a smile. Price's formal response to the amended water claim was filed the following week, and it incorporated everything: the survey addendum, the community testimony statements, the Moss Declaration, and the documented history of Vernon Pike's financial interest in the Red Hollow Courier and the sequence of events that connected that interest to the original newspaper piece. Price had also, without being asked, submitted a separate complaint to the Territorial Business Licensing Board regarding consolidated range resources, filing practices, specifically the omission of the survey addendum from the supporting documentation submitted to the Water Committee. He's thorough, Bramwell said when she read him the summary. He said the same thing about me, she said. I think it's why we get along. The response from Consolidated Range Resources lawyers came 3 weeks later, and it was longer and more expensive looking than useful, the kind of legal document that demonstrates resources rather than arguments. Price responded to it in 4 pages where they'd used 20. Meanwhile, the cooperative water meeting at the ranch happened on a cold Saturday afternoon, with 9 families present, more than Elowen had expected, and more than the kitchen could comfortably hold, which meant people were standing in the hall, and one family sat on the porch steps with the door open, which said something about how much the meeting mattered to them. Bramwell talked at that meeting in a way he hadn't talked at the town hall, technically, practically, about the aquifer, the spring locations, the seasonal variation in output, the channels that existed and the ones that needed building. He drew a map from memory on the back of a flour sack that showed the water system of Thorne Valley with the accuracy of a man who had spent 12 years paying attention to it. The 9 families sat around that map and talked about it for 3 hours. What came out of it wasn't a polished plan. There were disagreements about access schedules, arguments about who would supply what labor, one heated exchange between 2 neighbors who had an older dispute about a fence line that had nothing to do with water, but had been waiting for an opportunity to surface. Elowen managed that last one by saying, flatly, that the fence dispute was a separate matter, and they could table it or leave. And both men chose to table it with the irritated dignity of people who know they're being sensible against their will. At the end of the 3 hours, they had the rough architecture of something workable. Not finished, not clean, but real. Bramwell walked the last family to their wagon in the dark, and when he came back inside, he stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the map on the table, the flour sack with its penciled springs and channels and property lines, with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. What? She said. 12 years, he said. I've been managing that water alone for 12 years. You don't have to anymore, she said. He looked at the map for another moment. Then he picked it up carefully and folded it along the pencil lines and put it on the shelf above the fireplace, next to the little wooden horse. She watched him do it. Bramwell, she said. He turned. I got a letter from my father today, she said. He said the homestead made it through to December on what I sent them from our harvest share. He said my brothers are both healthy. She paused. He said to tell you he's grateful. Bramwell looked at her. He doesn't need to be, he said. He is anyway, she said. People are, sometimes, regardless of whether you think they need to be. Something shifted in his face. How is he said. Your father. Not just the farm, how is he? She thought about the letter. Her father's handwriting, which had always been confident, had been slightly less certain in the last 2 letters. Age or worry or both. He's managing, she said honestly. He's not young, and it's been hard years. In the spring, Bramwell said, if the legal situation has settled enough, we should go. To Delwood. She looked at him. You haven't seen them since you left, he said. That's been 4 months, she said. That's too long, he said. In the spring. She didn't say anything for a moment, because there wasn't a way to respond to that didn't involve feelings she wasn't going to perform in the kitchen. In the spring, she agreed. December arrived with the seriousness of a Montana winter that had been patient and was now done being patient. The passes closed. The valley pulled in on itself the way mountain valleys do, becoming its own world, the distances to other places doubling and tripling in the weight of snow and cold. The cooperative water agreement was formally documented and submitted to Price, who incorporated it into the ongoing legal response. The Territorial Water Board had scheduled a review hearing for February, a date that felt both urgent and very far away. Vernon Pike had not responded to any further communication. Price reported that Consolidated Range Resources' lawyers had requested an extension on their filing, which Price characterized as a delaying tactic while they assessed whether to pursue or withdraw. "He's waiting," Elowen said one evening. "For what?" Bramwell said. "To see if we run out of will," she said, "or money, or both." They were sitting by the fire which had become the evening habiter, with her correspondence, him with whatever needed mending or planning, the lamp between them on the side table. It was a quiet life in the outer shape of it. The inside shape was more complicated, but she'd stopped being surprised by that. "Are we going to?" he said. "Run out of will," she said. "Money," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Honest answer, it was closer than she liked. Price's deferred fee arrangement helped, but there were other costs, and the winter had reduced their income to what they'd put aside in the fall, which was enough but not generously so. "We're all right through February," she said. "If the hearing goes well, we're through this." She paused. "If it doesn't go well, we'll have a different problem to solve." "And you'll solve it," he said. Not flattery, just a statement of what he believed. She looked at him across the lamp. "We'll solve it," she said. He nodded, went back to the harness strap he was working on. She went back to her letters. Outside, the snow came down on the mountain and on the valley and on the bare aspens and on the springs that ran cold and clear and constant from the limestone shelf that had been putting water into this land for longer than anyone had been keeping records about it. The water didn't care about claims or committees or lawyers in Helena. It moved because that was its nature, finding the lowest ground, filling what was empty. Elowen listened to the wind for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the letter she was writing to Edmund Price, laying out the community testimony in the order she thought would be most useful when the February hearing arrived, building the case piece by careful piece, the way you build anything that needs to last. She was still writing when the lamp oil ran low, and she got up to refill it herself rather than wake Bramwell, who had fallen asleep in his chair with the harness strap in his lap, and his head tilted at an angle that was going to give him a stiff neck in the morning. She looked at him for a moment before she turned back to the lamp. He looked, in sleep, like a man who had finally stopped bracing for the next thing. She thought, good. She turned the lamp up and kept writing. The February hearing was scheduled for the 14th, which gave Elowen exactly 6 weeks from the 1st of January to finish what needed finishing. She used all 6. The cooperative water agreement had been formalized by Price in late December and signed by 11 families more than she'd hoped for when Caleb first made his rounds. 2 of the Ifizines who'd initially said they needed to think about it had come back before Christmas, and a 12th family from the far northern edge of the valley had heard about it through the kind of informal network that functions in isolated communities through the winter and sent a letter asking to be included. She'd written back immediately. Price had assembled the full legal package by the 2nd week of January, the survey addendum, the Moss Declaration, the community testimony statements, the documented timeline of Vernon Pike's financial interests and their relationship to the events in Thorne Valley, and a formal brief arguing that the Consolidated Range Resources water rights claim had been filed on fraudulent grounds with procedurally compromised committee support. He'd sent Elowen a copy of the brief, and she'd read it at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, making margin notes on points where she thought the argument could be tightened. She sent those notes back to Price, who responded in his dry, precise way, "You've correctly identified the weakest section. I've revised accordingly." She took that as high praise, because from Edmund Price it probably was. What she hadn't anticipated was the letter that arrived in the 3rd week of January from a name she didn't recognize, a man called Robert Ainsley, writing from Helena on stationery that identified him as a partner in a firm that handled commercial property and business interests. The letter was addressed to both Elowen and Bramwell Thorne. It stated, in the careful language of legal correspondence, that his client wished to explore the possibility of resolving the water rights dispute through a mutually acceptable settlement prior to the February hearing, and that his client believed such a resolution could be reached without further legal proceedings if both parties were willing to engage in good faith discussion. His client was not named in the letter. She read it twice and then handed it to Bramwell without comment. He read it once. "Pike," he said. "Almost certainly," she said. "He wants to settle before the hearing." "He wants to settle before the hearing becomes public record," she said. "A hearing that goes on record establishes facts that can be referenced in future proceedings. If there are fraud implications in the filing process, and there are, he'd rather those never become documented testimony." Bramwell put the letter on the table. "What does Price think?" "I haven't told him yet," she said. "I wanted to talk to you first." He looked at her with a slight change in expression. The small, almost imperceptible thing that happened when she did something he hadn't expected, but that registered as right to him. "What do you think?" he said. She sat down across from him. "I think Vernon Pike is afraid," she said. "I think he's looked at what Price has assembled and does his own calculation and decided the hearing is going to go badly for him. Not just losing the water claim, losing it in a way that opens other doors." She paused. "A settlement that includes a full unconditional withdrawal of the water claim, a written acknowledgement that the original newspaper's piece was based on incomplete and deliberately shaped information, and a payment that covers our legal costs. That settlement protects Bramwell's name, secures the water, and ends the fight. And it protects Pike from the fraud implications," Bramwell said. "Yes," she said. "You're not comfortable with that," he said. He wasn't asking. She looked at her hands. "No," she said honestly. "I'm not entirely comfortable with it. A man who did what he did to your family, to your reputation, walk away from that without full public accounting, feels like an incomplete resolution." She stopped. "But what I'm comfortable with, and what's right for us, aren't always the same thing. We've spent real money on this fight. The hearing has risks, even with what we have. And if we win a settlement that achieves everything we actually need, the water, your name, our costs covered, then prolonging the fight for the satisfaction of public accountability is a choice I don't know I have the right to make on behalf of this family." Bramwell was quiet for a long time. "It's not just us," he said finally. She looked up. "The other families in the valley," he said. "The cooperative. If Pike walks away from this without consequence, what stops him from finding another mechanism in 2 years? 3 years? Against someone who doesn't have an Elowen to read land office records and write letters to Helena." She sat with that. She hadn't let herself think it quite so plainly, but he'd said it plainly, and he was right. "Write to Price," Bramwell said. "Tell him we're willing to discuss settlement terms. But the terms include full withdrawal of the claim, public acknowledgement through the courier, which is now under different ownership and will actually print what it's given, and a provision. A formal documented agreement that Consolidated Range Resources and any successor entity controlled by Vernon Pike will not file claims against water sources in this township for a period of 25 years. Elowen looked at him. "That's aggressive," she said. "Yes," he said. "He may refuse it." "Then we go to the hearing," Bramwell said. "And we win there instead." She looked at him across the table. This man she'd known for 5 months, who had said more words in that single exchange than he'd sometimes said in a full day, and who had said them with the flat, clear certainty of someone who had finally located the thing he was willing to fight for. "All right," she said. "I'll write to Price today." Price presented the settlement terms to Ainsley's firm on a Thursday. The response came back the following Monday, and it was not a refusal. It was a counter. Pike would agree to the full withdrawal, the public acknowledgement, and the legal cost coverage, but proposed a 15-year restriction rather than 25. Price responded, 20 years, and the public acknowledgement would be drafted by Price's office rather than Pike's lawyers. The counter came in 2 days, agreed. Elowen read the final confirmation letter on a Tuesday morning in late January, standing at the kitchen window in the early light, and she felt the particular sensation of something large that has been in motion for a long time coming to rest. Not triumph, she'd thought about what Bramwell had said, that she wasn't built for the feeling of triumph, but something more like the sensation, after a very long climb, when you stop and look back at the distance you've covered and understand for the first time how far it actually was. She folded the letter and set it on the table next to the flour sack map that Bramwell had moved from the fireplace shelf to the table weeks ago, because the cooperative planning sessions had needed it repeatedly. She picked up the wooden horse from the shelf. She hadn't touched it since the first night she'd arrived at the ranch and found it on her pillow. She'd looked at it many times, but she hadn't picked it up again until now. The carving was fine, work careful, patient, the kind of thing made by someone who had time and intention. the initials on the base, LT, small and deliberate. She heard Bramwell come in from the barn, heard him stop when he saw her standing at the fireplace with it. "The settlement is confirmed," she said. "Price's letter came this morning." He crossed to the table and picked up the letter and read it. She watched him read it, the way she watched him do most things, without making a production of watching, just noting. He set it down. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He looked at the wooden horse in her hands. "I made that," he said. "It wasn't information she didn't have. It was something else." "I know," she said. "I made it the winter before Lucy was born," he said. I had an idea of what she would be like. The kind of child who would want a horse of her own before she was old enough to ride one." He stopped. "I was right about that. She carried it everywhere." Elowen looked at the carved horse, the worn places on it where small hands had held it, over and over. "She sounds like she was wonderful," she said. "She was a pest," he said, with a roughness in his voice that wasn't grief exactly, or wasn't only grief. There was something like love in it that had survived losing her, the way the shape of a river survives the water that carved it. She talked constantly. She had opinions about everything, including things she had no basis for opinions about. She argued with the horses. "Did they argue back?" Elowen said. Something happened in his face. "The roan did," he said. "They had an ongoing disagreement." She smiled. It wasn't something she did casually. Smiling, she'd grown up in a household where there wasn't always much occasion for it. But it came naturally now, in this kitchen, in this house that had stopped being a stranger's house sometime around the end of October, without her marking exactly when. She put the wooden horse back on the shelf. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right. On our wedding night," she said, "you left the bedroom." He was quiet. "I know why," she said. "You've said enough, in pieces, over these months, that I understand why. I don't need the explanation." She paused. "What I want to know is, was it hard to do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. And then more honestly, yes, it was hard. But not for the reason you might think. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. It wasn't about wanting to stay. It was about being afraid that staying was the wrong choice. That you'd agreed to this marriage because your family needed security, and I'd taken advantage of that necessity. He paused. "I didn't want to be a man who took advantage of necessity." She thought about the 19-year-old who'd sat on the edge of a stranger's bed in the dark, holding a carved horse, crying without entirely knowing why. "I cried that night," she said. He looked startled. She'd never said it directly before. She'd come close, in various conversations, but she'd never said the plain fact. "I know," he said quietly. "I heard." She looked at him. "You heard. The walls are not—" He stopped. "The walls are not thick." She sat with that for a moment. "I didn't cry because I was frightened," she said. "I want you to know that. I cried because everyone in Delwood, everyone I knew, had spent weeks before I left telling me what kind of man you were. Cold. Dangerous. Someone who cared nothing for people." She paused. "And then within 2 days you gave me your coat and your bedroll and your better rations and a bedroom of your own. And you walked out of it without being asked." She met his eyes. "I cried because I'd been prepared to endure something, and instead I found something I didn't have a name for." He was very still. "I still don't entirely have a name for it," she said. "But I know what it's built of. It's built of a man who does the right thing when nobody's watching and doesn't expect credit for it. And that, in my experience, is rare enough to be worth crying over." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and he took her face in both hands, those weathered, careful hands that knew how to handle something fragile without breaking it, and he kissed her the way a man kisses someone when he's been working up to it for 5 months and is finally certain it's what they both want. It was not a perfect moment. He knocked her elbow against the shelf getting there, and she made an undignified sound of surprise, and afterward they were both standing in the kitchen slightly red-faced, which was so far from what she'd imagined such a moment would look like that she almost laughed. She did laugh, actually. And so did he, a real laugh, short and rusty with disuse, but genuine. "I've been wanting to do that since November," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew Bramwell," she said. "I watch you." He looked at her, with the expression she'd been learning to read for months, the one that held something that was working its way toward the surface from wherever he'd been keeping it. "I don't know how to—" He started. "You don't have to know how," she said. "We've got time." They went to Delwood in April, when the passes opened. Gerald Hart met them at the edge of the property, which meant he'd been watching the road, which Elowen understood and didn't comment on. He was thinner than she remembered, and his hair had more gray in it. But his handshake when he gripped Bramwell's hand was firm. And the look he gave his daughter was the look of a man reassessing something with relief. "You look well," he told Elowen. "I am well," she said, and meant it without qualification, which was a different thing from how she'd said such things before. Her brothers had grown, both of them, in the indiscriminate way that boys that age grow, like they're trying to cover distance before anyone notices. The younger one, Thomas, attached himself to Bramwell within about 20 minutes of arrival, with the fearless curiosity of an 8-year-old who hasn't yet learned to perform hesitation, asking questions about the horses and the mountains and the springs with such rapid intensity that Bramwell answered each one seriously, and at length which made Thomas follow him around for the rest of the first day, like a small devoted shadow. Elowen watched that from the kitchen doorway while she and her mother worked, and her mother said, without looking up from what she was doing, "He's good with the boy. He's good with things that need patience," Elowen said. Her mother glanced at her with the sideways perceptiveness that mothers develop and that adult daughters learn to stop being surprised by. "And you?" she said. "Are you happy?" Elowen thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm something better than happy," she said. "I'm engaged. In what I'm doing. In who I'm doing it with," she paused. "Happy is something you feel in a moment. What I have is something I feel while I'm working." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "That's more than most people get," she said. "I know," Elowen said. They stayed 4 days. On the last evening, Elowen Hart sat with Bramwell on the porch after dinner, and Elowen could hear them talking through the window. Not the words, just the rhythm of it. Two men negotiating some kind of understanding in the way that men who aren't naturally expressive sometimes do it, through the side door of practical conversation. When she came out to say the lamp was lit inside, her father looked at her and then at Bramwell and said, "You've got a good one there." "I'm aware," Bramwell said. "She was always the one who held things together," Gerald said. "I depended on that too much when she was young. I want you to know I know that." Bramwell looked at Gerald. "She holds things together because she chooses to," he said, "not because she doesn't have other choices." Gerald Hart was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, the way men nod when something they needed to hear has been said. The Water Board's formal confirmation of the settlement came in May, and with it a legal order recognizing the Thorne Valley Cooperative Water Agreement as the governing document for water use in the township. Edmund Price sent a brief note along with the confirmation. "Well done, both of you." The public acknowledgement ran in the Red Hollow Courier on the last Friday of May under its new ownership on the front page. It was not a dramatic piece. It was factual and specific, which was the right way to do it. It named the original article, described its basis as incomplete and editorially compromised, and stated clearly that the record showed Bramwell Thorne had acted with reasonable urgency and significant personal sacrifice in the winter of 1883. Dr. Hollis bought 3 copies. Agnes Tully bought 5, which she distributed to people she'd identified as needing to read it and probably wouldn't otherwise. Elowen read it once, at the kitchen table, and then folded it and put it in the document case, next to the survey addendum, and the certified records from Helena and Dr. Hollis's journal page. She'd keep them, not because she expected to need them again. She didn't, but because they were the record of what had happened, and she believed in keeping records. Vernon Pike left Red Hollow in June. Not dramatically, no public departure, no confrontation. He was simply no longer present in the territory. His freight operation absorbed into another company under different management. His connections to the local community quietly dissolved. People noted the absence, the way they noted the absence of a bad smell they'd gotten used to, with a certain relief that took a moment to identify. Harlan Moss resigned from the County Water Committee the same month, without explanation, and spent the following months being, by Agnes's account, noticeably quieter and more careful in his dealings than he'd been in years. He never spoke publicly about his role in the water claim. Elowen had agreed to that, and she held to the agreement because the part of her that believed in keeping agreements was stronger than the part of her that wanted public accounting. That was a thing she'd had to sit with. It wasn't comfortable. There were nights that summer when she lay awake thinking about whether she'd made the right call, whether protecting Sectum's son from public exposure had let a man walk away from real harm he'd enabled. She thought about the families in the valley who'd been at risk from the water claim and hadn't known it. She thought about what might have happened if she hadn't caught it in time. She didn't resolve it neatly. That was the honest truth. She made a decision she thought was right, and she lived with the parts of it that weren't entirely comfortable, and she didn't pretend the discomfort wasn't there. Bramwell, when she told him she was still troubled by it, said, "You protected his son. His son didn't make that choice." "I know," she said. "And Moss is living with what he did," he said. "That may not look like consequence from the outside, but it is one." She thought about that for a long time. "You're more philosophical about it than I expected," she said. I've had 4 years of practice," he said, "living with things I couldn't change." That was about as close as he ever came to discussing the grief directly, and she didn't push further. She'd learned that his grief for Maribel and Lucy was not a closed subject between them. He'd told her more about both of them over the months, in pieces, in the way he told things. But it wasn't something he unwrapped on demand. It was woven into him, and she'd stopped expecting to separate it from the man she knew because it wasn't separable. They were part of what had made him who he was, Maribel and Lucy. The grief and the love were the same thread. She didn't resent that. She'd thought she might had braced for it, honestly, in the early months, but she didn't. You didn't love someone's capacity for devotion and then ask them to prove it by forgetting the people they'd devoted it to first. The first summer of the cooperative was hard in the way that first years of anything built by committee are hard, scheduling conflicts. One significant argument between two neighboring families that required Elowen and Caleb to mediate separately before they could mediate together, a section of channel that had been repaired incorrectly and had to be done again, with everyone trying not to blame the person who'd done it wrong. The water rotations worked imperfectly in June and better in July, and reasonably well by August, which Elowen considered a success given what they were working with. Bramwell was at the center of the technical management, because he knew the water better than anyone, and because he turned out, to the mild surprise of the valley, to be a patient and specific teacher when people asked him the right questions. He wasn't transformed into someone sociable. He was still quieter than most, still more comfortable with horses than crowds. But he was present in the community in a way he hadn't been before, and people had adjusted their understanding of what his silence meant, not indifference. "Attention," Caleb said to Elowen. One afternoon in August, when they were repairing a section of shared fence, and Bramwell was 20 suntas away, explaining something about flow rate to two neighboring ranchers with the earnest precision of a man who finds the subject genuinely interesting. "He's different. He's the same," Elowen said. "People are seeing him differently." Caleb considered that. "Maybe both," he said. "Maybe," she allowed. She'd thought about that question, whether Bramwell had changed, or whether the change was in how he was seen, or whether those two things were separable, and she'd decided she didn't need to resolve it. What she knew was that the man who had placed an advertisement for a wife with practical disposition and no romantics was the same man who had spent 6 months watching her fight for his name and his land and, without making speeches about it, had fought alongside her in the ways he was built for. He hadn't transformed. He'd been met, finally, by something that matched what he was. She thought that was probably true for both of them. It was in late September, almost exactly a year since Elowen had climbed down from the stagecoach in Red Hollow and found a careful, watchful man waiting for her, that they went to the cottonwood tree. It was Bramwell who suggested it. He said it on a Sunday morning in the plain way he said things. "I'd like to go to the tree today. If you'd come with me." She went. The two markers were weathered, but legible. She'd looked at them from a distance many times, but had never stood close to them before. Maribel's name and the dates. And the smaller one with Lucy's. She stood beside Bramwell and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the moment didn't already contain. After a while he said, "I used to come out here and feel like I was stuck here. Like I couldn't move forward, because moving forward meant leaving them further behind." She listened. "I don't feel that way anymore," he said. It's not that the grief is less. It's that I understand better what it is. It's the part of loving someone that doesn't have anywhere to go when they're gone. It doesn't mean I'm stuck. It means I love them." He paused. "I think I confused the two for a long time." She took his hand. Not dramatically. Just reached over and took it. The way you take the hand of someone you've been standing beside for long enough that the gesture doesn't require announcement. He held it. "You could have told me any of this," he said. "When I walked out of that bedroom on our wedding night, you could have come after me, asked questions, demanded an explanation." "I could have," she said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about 19-year-old Elowen, sitting in the dark with the carved horse, crying without quite knowing why. Because I understood, even then, that you needed to offer things on your own terms, she said. And because she paused. Because anyone worth knowing takes time to know. I wasn't going to demand in a week what needed months. He was quiet for a moment. That's the kindest thing anyone has done for me in a long time, he said. It wasn't kindness, she said. It was patience. There's a difference. What's the difference, she considered. Kindness is something you give, she said. Patience is something you choose over and over because you believe the thing you're waiting for is worth waiting for. He looked at her. Was it? Yes, she said. Was I? He brought her hand up briefly, just briefly, and that was enough. The years that followed were not uncomplicated. She didn't believe in telling stories that made hard things sound easy, and the truth was that building a life in a mountain valley in Montana in the late 1880s was genuinely hard, in the accumulating practical way that hard means. The winters that tested the water cooperative and produced arguments that required resolution, the year the hay was poor, and everyone in the valley felt it. The spring her mother's cough got worse, and she spent 3 weeks in Delwood helping, while Bramwell managed the ranch alone and sent her weekly letters in his careful handwriting that were short on sentiment and long on specific, domestic detail, which was its own kind of love letter. There were things between her and Bramwell that took years to find their footing. He wasn't easy to live with in the way that people with significant interior lives are often not easy to live with. He went quiet in ways that took her time to learn to read, and she pushed harder than she sometimes should have because she had her own difficulty with uncertainty. They argued. Not often, but genuinely, with the friction of two people who are both accustomed to being right and are both, periodically, wrong. The bay mare that Bramwell had been working with when Elowen arrived turned out to have the most singular personality of any horse on the property, opinionated and clever, and moderately untrustworthy around anyone who hadn't earned her confidence, which made her both difficult and irreplaceable. Elowen eventually developed a working relationship with her based on mutual suspicion and respect, which was also how the mare got along with most people who lasted. The cooperative grew. By 1891, it included 19 families and had formalized enough that Price helped them draft a proper charter, a document that established governance, responsibilities, and the rights of members in language that would hold up in a territorial court. Red Hollow began directing disputes about water access to the cooperative's appointed committee rather than to the county authority, which was the kind of organic recognition that meant more than any official designation. Bramwell was on that committee. He hadn't wanted to be. He'd said, with his characteristic economy, that committees were not where he was most useful. But Caleb and Elowen had made the case that his specific knowledge of the water system was not optional. It was the technical foundation without which the committee couldn't function. He'd agreed, reluctantly, and had turned out to be a committee member who said very little and was very right when he said anything, which made him more influential than more vocal members. The Red Hollow Courier, under its new ownership, ran a piece about the cooperative in the spring of 1892. It was a straightforward account without sentimentality, but it named Bramwell and Elowen Thorne as the people whose work had made the initial legal defense of the valley's water possible. Bramwell read it once and put it down and went out to check the horses. Elowen read it twice and thought it was reasonably accurate and moved on. Agnes Tully clipped it and kept it, because Agnes kept things that mattered. There was an evening in the late fall of 1892, 5 years, after Elowen had answered the hell in the week, when they were sitting by the fire in the way they'd been sitting by fires together for 5 years, and a neighbor's daughter, a girl of about 15, who had been helping with some work around the property, said something that stayed with Elowen for a long time afterward. The girl, her name was Ruth, and she was bright in the immediate, unguarded way of people who haven't yet learned to protect their intelligence, had been watching Elowen and Bramwell in the particular way that young people watch marriages, trying to understand, taking inventory. She said, on her way out at the end of the day, Mrs. Thorne, can I ask you something? You can ask, Elowen said. How did you know? Ruth said, with the directness of 15, that you'd made the right choice. When you first came here, how did you know? Elowen thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. I didn't, she said. I made the best decision I could with what I knew, and then I stayed with it long enough to learn whether it was right. But what if it hadn't been? Then I would have had to make different decisions, Elowen said. But you can't know what you're choosing and you've chosen it and lived in it for a while. Anyone who tells you different is selling you something. Ruth considered this with the serious attention of someone filing it away. Do you think that's true for most things? She said. Elowen thought about box 14, about a stagecoach and a careful, watchful man in a coat that smelled of wood smoke, about a wooden horse on a pillow and 2 initials, and a night spent crying for reasons she hadn't fully understood until much later. Most things worth choosing, she said, you don't fully understand until after you've chosen them. Ruth went home, and Elowen stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the mountains, which were already white down to the tree line. She heard Bramwell come up behind her. What did she want to know? He said. How to make good choices, Elowen said. What did you tell her? The truth, she said. That you make the best choice you can, and then you show up for it. He stood beside her in the doorway, looking at the same mountains she was looking at, and she felt the specific warmth of him, the particular way he took up space that she'd learned so well over 5 years that she could identify it in the dark. We did all right, he said. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't even exactly satisfaction. It was an accounting a man who kept honest records, acknowledging what the ledger showed. We did, she said. The little wooden horse was on the shelf above the fireplace, where it had been since the night she'd first arrived and found it on her pillow. It had been there through the water fight, and the winter negotiations, and the cooperative meetings, and the trips to Helena, and the trip to Delwood, and every quiet evening by the fire, and every difficult morning that required more than either of them had wanted to give. Not hidden, not put away. Lucy Thorne, who had argued with a roan horse and carried a small carved toy everywhere and been loved entirely by a man who was still, 5 years later, building something from the wreckage of losing her. And Elowen Thorne, who had answered an advertisement in a newspaper and found, on the other side of that decision, not the life she'd agreed to, but the life she'd been working toward, without knowing it built on documents and patience, and the understanding that the truth, carefully gathered and clearly stated, is the only foundation that holds. She closed the door against the cold. The fire was warm. The house was solid. And outside, the water ran on quiet and constant, finding its way down from the mountain through channels that 11 families had built together, into a valley that had learned, slowly and imperfectly, to take care of what it had.